is described as one of the worst forms of antisocial behaviour, as the consequences can be fatal. If caught speeding, does the Home Secretary agree that no one should be above the law?
Well, as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, last summer I was speeding. I regret that. I paid the fine and I took the penalty. And at no point did I attempt to evade sanction. What I am focused on is working for more police, and that's why I'm proud that it's this Conservative government that has secured a record number of police officers in the history of policing. This side of the House is focused on the people's priorities.
Sit down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to a joint letter I received from the Home Secretary and the Levelling Up Secretary on the 27th of March 2023, quote, tackling antisocial behaviour is an absolute priority for this government. So how, given that, can 450 fewer police officers in Merseyside since 2010 and just 69p per person invested into the immediate justice pilot in any way in the real world be classed as anything approaching tackling antisocial behaviour?
Well, I'm very pleased that, thanks to this government's commitment, Merseyside has received increased funding of millions of pounds when compared to previous years. But most importantly, there has been 7 rounds of Safer Street Fund projects in Merseyside, with a total of £2.9 million funding provided over 4 rounds. And I'm very glad that Merseyside has been chosen as one of our pilot areas for our immediate justice. That's one of the ways that we're going to kick antisocial behaviour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for her earlier answer. In Stoke-on-Trent North Kidsgrove and Talk, we're delighted to have seen over 330 brand new police officers recruited, new CCTV in Kidsgrove Parish, and over £2 million in Safer Streets funding for Stoke-on-Trent. But sadly, in places like Cobridge, crime increased 75% between January and December 2022. That's why I launched a Safer Streets petition, which has over 430 signatures. Can my right honourable friend work with me to get the Police Crime Commissioner and the City Council together with myself so we can get a bid in for the next Safer Streets pots to make sure we can keep the streets safe in Tunstall, Cobridge and Smallthorne?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is doing a great job of standing up for his constituents when it comes to antisocial behaviour, and we launched the action plan back in March to crack down on precisely the kind of behaviour that he's been talking about. The plan is backed by over £160 million of new funding. That includes funding for an increased police and other uniformed presence in ASB hotspots, and I'm glad that his force is also chosen as one of the pilots.
To Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to see the plan being brought forward, because only last week I was speaking to parish councillors from Bagworth who've had real problems with vandalism and graffiti in some of their programmes, so much so that they're thinking of closing them. And this has happened in places like Shilton and Barwell too, where I've heard stories. So can she say how will this plan help support communities like mine?
Well, I was very pleased to visit Leicestershire Police for some months ago, and I am committed to supporting communities and the police. I'm pleased that Leicestershire Police has received £2.8 million through 4 rounds of Safer Streets funds, including £800,000 in the current round to fund projects such as youth diversion activities, ASB education programmes and target hardening. We funded several initiatives. This is how we work together with other agencies to ensure that our streets are safer, communities can restore pride, and ultimately that criminals are put behind bars.
Aaron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Kendal, we're very proud of the recently set up Youth Matters project, which is about engaging young people with worthwhile activities to do with their time. Will she agree that, as well as tackling antisocial behaviour by firm and adequately resourced policing, it's really important that she works with her colleagues in the Department for Education to boost youth work, in particular detached youth work, to help give young people worthwhile things to do with their time? Could she tell us something about what she's seeking to do to improve funding for that part of our armoury against antisocial behaviour?
Hear, hear. Listen, tackling antisocial behaviour is one of my priorities, and that's why I launched the plan with the Prime Minister. It is also it requires a multifaceted solution, a lot of which must be focused on youth diversion. I was very pleased to visit a boxing project a few weeks ago in which money from the Home Office was diverted to encourage young people off the streets to take up a sport, to work with mentors, to learn a new skill, and it's a great way of reducing crime.
Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary rightly said that antisocial behaviour brings misery and menace. As part of local antisocial behaviour plans, neighbourhood and traffic police across the country will rightly be cracking down on speeding and dangerous driving. Does the Home Secretary think that people who speed should be given the option to get private speeding awareness courses rather than doing them with everyone else? And in her own case, what exactly did she ask her civil servants to help her with?
Mr. Speaker, hopefully we're not going to be too repetitive today. But as I said earlier, last summer I was speeding. I regret that. I paid the fine and I accepted the points, and at no point did I seek to evade the sanction. But let's be honest about what this is all about, Mr. Speaker. The Shadow Minister would rather distract, really, frankly, from the abject failure by the Labour Party to offer any serious proposals on crime or policing. They want to talk about this because it distracts. It distracts from the fact that they voted against tougher sentences for paedophiles and murderers. They want us to ignore the fact that Labour MPs would rather campaign to stop the deportation of foreign criminals than back our Rwanda scheme. They would rather the country doesn't notice their total abandonment of the British people. This government is focusing on delivering a record...
Order. Can I just say to the Home Secretary, she said she didn't want to be repetitive, and that goes all round the chamber as well. Patricia Gibson.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the points-based system serves the whole of the United Kingdom. As noted in the Migration Advisory Committee annual report, immigration policy cannot be a complete solution to population movements within the United Kingdom or to labour shortages. The Scottish Government has policy levers to address these issues more effectively.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Government has repeatedly raised it. I have had a debate on it, and my SNP colleagues have raised it over and over again. Labour shortages are posing huge challenges for Scotland right now. The Scottish Government proposed a rural immigration pilot, a proposal welcomed by one of the Home Office's predecessors, the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove. So why will the UK Government not engage with the Scottish Government on this important issue, given that the Scottish Government has no powers in this area?
Well, we believe strongly that the UK is better served by a single national immigration service, and there's no material difference between unemployment or economic inactivity rates in Scotland versus the rest of the United Kingdom. The first port of call for vacancies should always be the domestic workforce. That's why my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, has brought forward a wide package of measures across the whole of the country to help more people into the workforce. It isn't right that we always reach for the lever of immigration to solve those challenges.
Does my right honourable friend, when thinking about net migration and the level it should be at, we shouldn't just be thinking about GDP and economic impact, but also social and cultural impact of rapid change of that scale, pressure on public services and also housing as well?
Well, it's right that we consider economic growth and the needs of our economy, but my honourable friend is absolutely right to say that these decisions also require careful consideration of the impact of very large amounts of legal migration upon housing, upon access to public services, and as he says, to community cohesion and integration. That's absolutely the approach of the Government and of the Home Secretary and I in considering this challenge.
Shadow Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ending the small boat crossings is, of course, one way of reducing immigration, and Labour has a 5-point plan to do just that. But asylum seekers are only a fraction of the net migration total. The reason that net migration is so high in Scotland and across the UK, and the reason that businesses are over-reliant on migrant labour, is that for 13 years the party opposite has failed to train up our homegrown talent. They've slashed the skills budget, they've failed to get people off record-high NHS waiting lists and back to work. Labour has set out plans to do each of these things because we want and expect immigration to come down. And yet the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary are clearly at loggerheads on this issue. It appears that the right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing. So the Home Secretary, I would ask her if she can confirm, is she still committed to the 2019 Conservative Manifesto pledge of bringing net migration below 226,000? And if so, does she think that the Prime Minister agrees with her?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. This party wants to bring net migration down. I have no idea what the party opposite wants to do. We've heard in the last few days a succession of shadow ministers confused on this issue. The Conservative government believes in controlled migration. We only have to look back to the legacy of the last Labour government to see that under Labour there's always an open-door approach to migration. We will control it. The Labour Party will leave an open-door migration policy.
Mr. Speaker.
Oh, thank you very much. I apologise.
There we go. Mr. Speaker, I'm in regular correspondence with the devolved administrations about the illegal migration bill. I recently met with the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Angus Robertson, and last week I wrote to the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice proposing a meeting which I hope will happen later this week.
Owen Thompson. Mr. Speaker, not only is this bill being driven through Parliament at breakneck speed, but the Scottish Government's been given no opportunity yet to consider these proposals properly before their introduction. Does the Minister therefore agree that any regulations that would amend, repeal or revoke any Scottish legislation or any devolved matter cannot possibly come into force through this bill without the consent of the Scottish Ministers?
Hear, hear. Well, I think I just made clear that I have reached out to colleagues in the Scottish Government, but immigration is a reserved matter and is a matter for this Parliament to dictate our future borders policy. I hope that the honourable gentleman will support the bill, as from the figures that I've seen, his constituency in Midlothian currently has no asylum seekers in dispersal accommodation and no asylum seekers in contingency accommodation, such as hotels. 0 asylum seekers in the honourable gentleman's constituency. He is, I'm afraid, yet another example of humanitarian NIMBYism by the SNP.
Mr. Speaker, in addition to the devolved administrations, would the Minister kindly share details on the discussions that he's had with local authorities, local government and local councils in particular, around the provisions of the bill? And may I ask him as well, how does that relate in terms of the government's plans to accommodate people in Wethersfield, including those who would be covered under this bill?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. When she was Home Secretary, she set out the policy to create large sites on which to house asylum seekers in a more focused and less expensive manner. She took forward a proposal for a site in the north of England. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and I have continued that tradition and have set forth plans for 3 sites, one at Bexhill, one at Wethersfield and one at Scampton.
SNP spokesperson Alison Thoutless.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Trafficking Awareness Raising Alliance, TARA, supported 156 women in their service during 2021 and 2022. Of these, 138 women were seeking asylum or were undocumented when they were referred to TARA. Brona Andrew of TARA told the Scottish Parliament's Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee that had the illegal migration bill been in place, those women would not have been able to access our support. In the face of clear evidence of the harm that the Tories' illegal migration bill will cause, what possible justification can the Minister give for removing support from trafficked women in Scotland and strengthening the hand of those that would exploit them?
Well, the bill is based on a very simple principle, that we want to break the people smugglers and human traffickers' business model. By supporting this bill, I know she opposes it, but by supporting this bill, we will do that, and we will stop people crossing in these dangerous, unnecessary journeys, and fewer cases, such as the ones the Honourable Lady raises, will happen in the future. But I go back to the point I said to her colleague. If the SNP feels so strongly about this issue, why do they do so little to support asylum seekers in Scotland? Currently, there are 11 contingency hotels in the whole of Scotland housing 600 migrants. That is 1% of all those asylum seekers in the country. She never matches her words with deeds.
Number 5, please.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will group this with number 8 and 13. We've recently launched our strategy to tackle fraud, as well as measures in the online safety bill that will require companies to prevent fraud, and measures in the economic crime and corporate transparency bill to hold companies to account for fraud committed by their employees. We're working with tech companies as well to agree other measures and are improving the support we give to victims.
Nigel Mills.
Thank him for that answer. We know that 80% of fraud starts online and 18% comes from the tech companies he's talking about. Yet they don't contribute to any of the costs of reimbursing that fraud, despite making profit effectively from causing it. Isn't it time we looked at asking them to actually contribute to reimbursing some of the losses that they're introducing into the system?
Well, my honourable friend is raising questions that we've been looking at very closely in the fraud strategy, and he's absolutely right to highlight the disparity between those who are causing and those who are paying. And so this is a conversation that we've been having, and I look forward to bringing forward very soon some areas on which we can discuss this further. The reality is that action fraud has not always helped as well, and that's why we're looking at making a more efficient system.
Speaker, at my surgery in South last month, I met Catherine, whose father was defrauded out of thousands after taking a call from a man who he thought worked for Virgin Media. Catherine only found out about this after her father unfortunately passed away, when she found all the emails he had sent attempting to get his money back, a battle that Catherine has now taken on. Can the Minister tell the House what he is doing to stop vulnerable people being targeted by fraudsters?
First of all, can I offer absolute sympathy to Catherine? Sadly, although he's citing the incident of an older man there who was the target of crime, the reality is this is a crime that affects many people of all ages across our society. It's not specifically connected to the most vulnerable. Actually, this is a crime that actually affects predominantly people who are online more often. So, as you can imagine, that is many, many people across society. Now, we are launching the nationwide rollout of the National Economic Crime Victim Care Unit across England and Wales for victims whose cases are not investigated by the police, and this group will help victims to recover from fraud and cybercrime and significantly reduce the likelihood of repeat victimisation.
Martin Vickers.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the proposal of the Minister suggesting that action fraud should have greater capacity. I've experienced a number of constituency cases where elderly people have been robbed of their life savings, and there was a feeling that insufficient priority was being given to this. Can the Minister give an assurance that there will be a renewed focus on dealing with these scams that destroy people's lives?
I can absolutely give that commitment, and the reality is that these scams, which to some people appear victimless, sadly are anything but. The connection to very serious mental health issues that follow is sadly all too clear, and many of us in our constituency work have come across individuals for whom these events have resulted in extreme suffering and sometimes even worse.
Mr.
Speaker, it is staggering that fraud now accounts for almost half of crime, and yet barely any of those crimes are actually investigated, and less than 0.1% of them actually make it to court. Hardly anything seems to be being done to upgrade police technology and practice to help deal with this. So seriously, what is the government actually doing that is going to make any sort of difference?
Well, the Honourable Lady will have heard only a few weeks ago that we launched our new fraud strategy. This includes 400 officers in the National Fraud Squad, and it includes an increase in resources, some £400 million, to helping police forces across the country. Now, a lot of this work is being done, has already been started, and a lot of it still has to be done. And what we're doing is we're making sure that that focus is there, because as she correctly says, 40% of crime, some 40% of crime is now fraud, and the UK has sadly received too many attempts to defraud our people for several reasons. One of them is the way our banking system works and the speed of banking in the UK, and another is the English language, which I'm afraid makes it significantly easier for fraudsters overseas to act against our people. It's also absolutely true that much of this crime, a significant amount of this crime, is not here in the UK but is abroad, so working with partners around the world is important.
Speaker, there's 3.7 million incidents of fraud last year. So can the Minister say, why does he think only 0.1% of those cases actually make it to court?
This is actually a challenge that we've been working with the Department of Justice on, and he's absolutely right to highlight it. A lot of the reason for that is because many of the crimes are committed abroad or are not followed up. Sometimes it's because people are embarrassed to report it, which is a great shame because they should not be embarrassed. This is a crime like any other. And often it's because the ability to collect evidence is very difficult. But that's exactly why we've launched the new National Fraud Squad, in order to help police forces across the country, working with the regional and organised crime units, to actually bring not just the evidence but eventually the prosecution through the CPS, to make sure that we don't just have reports of fraud, but we have prosecutions and convictions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just over a year ago, the anti-fraud minister, Lord Agnew, resigned in anger at the billions being lost and written off in COVID fraud payments. He said to the Treasury Select Committee on which I sit, quote, "I don't think there is anybody who would condone a weak system which allows money to fall in the laps of crooks, and that's what I saw happening." Lord Agnew, of course, being a Conservative minister. So can the minister tell us what has changed, has anything, either in the amount of money in COVID fraud repayments being recovered or the attitude of the Treasury?
Well, as the Honourable Lady knows very well, this government has been taking fraud very seriously on these matters here. And the reason I can say that with absolute confidence is because we've just worked up a national fraud strategy for the first time in many years. We've got the money behind it, we've got the conviction, we've got the commitment behind it, and we have now the officers behind it. This is an extremely important area of crime, and it's an area of crime that we've been taking seriously in order to make sure that it reduces alongside other areas of crime, and that is exactly what this government's going to do.
The Minister does show.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the government, fraud is now the most common crime in the UK, costing almost £7 billion a year, with 1 in 15 people falling victim. The number of victims of fraud have skyrocketed amidst a cost of living crisis, with victims completely left without any hope. Police forces up and down the country are crying out loud to have resources in place to tackle the ever-growing and advancing ways in which criminals exploit people to commit fraud. If the government cares and is serious about fraud and its victims, why do the government ministers persistently exclude fraud from the crime statistics?
This is a slightly strange line because it is in the crime surveys of England and Wales, so I'm afraid I simply don't understand which surveys she's looking at. She may, it's worth pointing out that she may be thinking of the crime surveys from before 2010, which makes it very hard to compare them because Labour didn't count fraud and we do.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Over 24,000 people have arrived in the UK from Afghanistan under or since Operation Pitting, of which 21,000 have been resettled under the ARAP or ACRS schemes. There isn't a visa application centre in Afghanistan for security reasons, but those who have left the country can make a visa application in the normal way. The ACRS is designed to support vulnerable people, such as women and girls at risk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the fourth time in recent weeks, I feel compelled to raise on the floor of this House the case of 5 British children who have been in hiding in Kabul for the last 18 months. 4 of these British passport holders are girls, and only 1 of them is allowed to attend school. I and my team have not been able to bring them to safety to be with their family in the UK because
their Afghan mother can't secure a visa. Now, I'm grateful that the Minister has looked at this case personally, but it has stalled again because his officials are insisting she travels to Pakistan to do her biometrics. He will be aware it is totally unsafe for a woman to risk her life to travel on her own without a chaperone to Pakistan to get a visa, even if Pakistan grant her a visa to travel there. So please, will the Minister waive the biometrics requirement in this case and for other women and girls who face mortal danger like this family do?
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for the tenacious way in which she's represented her constituents. She knows that I intervened personally to seek a swift resolution to this case. I'm told that UKVI have the application under consideration and are speaking with the Honourable Lady's office to help progress the application, and I hope we can resolve it very soon.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister accept that the female population of Afghanistan is enslaved at present? Has he seen the amazing film by the courageous Sky correspondent Alex Crawford called Women at War Afghanistan, which spells this out? And will he perhaps spend a moment to look at EDM 1188, marking today the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Academic Assistance Council, now the Council for At-Risk Academics, which I came across while they were trying to rescue female academics from potential enslavement and bring them to this country so they could join the faculty of the University of Southampton, amongst others.
Well, I'd be pleased to take a look at the material that he's recommended to me, and in particular the early day motion. The treatment of women and girls in Afghanistan by the Taliban is abhorrent. We all condemn that, and that's one of the reasons why we've created the ACRS scheme to support as many as we possibly can.
Joanna Churry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with the Prime Minister to discuss the plight of female judges and prosecutors who were encouraged by the United Kingdom to take up these roles when we were trying to produce a democracy under the rule of law in Afghanistan. I'd like to see humanitarian visas for some of these women so that they can come to the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister seemed quite sympathetic and said he would take it away and look at it. Can the Minister assure me that the Home Office would also be sympathetic to this request?
Well, I'd be very happy to look into that issue. I remember that she has campaigned on this for some time, in fact, since the fall of Kabul. So perhaps if she and I meet to discuss this further, would be a useful way forwards.
Thank you, Speaker. As part of the government's resettlement scheme for Afghan citizens facing threats of persecution from the Taliban, the Home Office granted visas for the Afghan women's football junior development team. The women's parliamentary football team played a match against them, and despite the studded tackle that left me wincing in agony, I was struck by their gratitude and appreciation of our generous and life-saving hospitality. However, there are many sportswomen left in Afghanistan banned from participating in their sport by the Taliban, under threat of severe recriminations if they even dare kick a ball, ride a bike or wield a cricket bat. So could the Minister tell the House what he is doing to support those women and girls, particularly if they are wishing to come to the UK to play their sport?
Well, the Taliban, as the Honourable Lady, my honourable friend, has said, have banned Afghan women and girls from competing in sports and exercising in gyms. Afghan women who competed in sports ranging from football to cycling are now forced to stay home amid the kind of intimidation that she refers to. I think particularly of the bravery of those Afghan women who recently posed for photos with the Associated Press alongside the equipment that they used to be able to use, now covering their faces with burqas. These are the reasons why we've made the important and generous offer that we have through the ACRS, a scheme that we want to take forward and help more women and girls out of Afghanistan to a place of safety and a new life in the UK.
Question number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the government takes the protection of the public and security incidents at immigration detention centres extremely seriously. I met with senior Serco executives on the 4th of May to discuss their response to the incident at Yarl's Wood in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency. An independent investigation into this incident is now underway and will consider its findings in detail.
Follow.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for that response? Will he join me in also thanking the Chief Constable of Bedfordshire Police, Trevor Roddenhurst, for working with other police forces across the country? I understand that all but one of those that have absconded have been rearrested, along with arrests being made for others who have facilitated those people whilst they have been out of detention. But there are serious questions that remain to be answered, both about the comparative ease with which people could abscond from the facility and the interaction between Serco and the police. So will my right honourable friend please look at those issues as well?
Can I join him in thanking Bedfordshire Police for leading on the national response to the incident? He's correct that of the 8 men who escaped, only 1 now remains at large, and we're determined to find him as quickly as possible. There are robust security measures at play in IRCs, but these are now being reviewed again in light of this incident. I met with senior Serco executives to hold them to account for their conduct and to ensure that they take this incident extremely seriously. I know that the Honourable Gentleman will be visiting Yarlswood soon, and I'd be very happy to speak with him and understand his reflections.
Question number 10.
With your permission, I would like to group this with question 21, Mr. Speaker. Our illegal migration bill will end illegal entry as a route to asylum in the United Kingdom, breaking the business model of the people smuggling gangs and restoring fairness to our asylum system.
Susan Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, tackling illegal immigration like small boats is a hot topic of many of my constituents, and I hear it time and time again on the doorstep and in my inbox. Can my right honourable friend assure the people of Stourbridge that it is this government that can be trusted that will make every effort possible to ensure what is a complex problem to stop the illegal boats?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The Prime Minister and I are determined to stop the boats. We are doubling the number of UK-funded personnel in France, and for the first time, specialist UK officers are embedded with their French counterparts. Whereas I'm afraid the Labour Party have consistently voted against our measures, not just in the illegal migration bill, but also in the Nationality and Borders Act. We know they'd scrap Rwanda. The truth is, they don't want to stop the boats, they want to open our borders.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, in a recent interview, the Leader of the Opposition was unable to say whether he'd repeal the Public Order Act, which protects the public against seriously disruptive protests. Given this flip-flopping on key legislation, does my right honourable friend agree that it is only this Conservative government that can be trusted to stop the boats, and that it is entirely possible that the party opposite, having tried to vote down the illegal migration bill several times, will change their mind on that as well?
Well, again, my honourable friend makes a very good point. The British people would be forgiven for failing to keep up with changing Labour policy. On the one hand, they opposed our public order bill, and on the other, they said they wouldn't repeal it. They are in favour of campaigning to keep foreign criminals in the country, and yet they want to scrap our Rwanda plan. This government, this Conservative Prime Minister, this side of the House are focused on stopping the boats, taking the fight to the militant protesters and standing up for the British people.
Andrew Gwynne.
Thank you. Last December, the Prime Minister promised that the Home Office would recruit another 700 new staff to the Small Boat Operational Command. How many of those 700 staff are now in post?
Well, the Prime Minister last year set out a detailed plan on how we are stopping the boats, and he is right to refer to our increased personnel on our Small Boats Operational Command. I'm very pleased to say we're making very good progress on increasing the personnel working on the channel. We've increased the number of caseworkers making progress on our asylum backlog, and we're increasing the way we are bearing down on this issue.
Mr. Speaker, Afghans make up one of the largest cohorts of small boat migrants, and in part that is because the legal routes aren't working. Let me give the Home Secretary a quick example. Families who are approved under ARAP but are stuck in Islamabad are now being told that they need to source their own accommodation to get here, but there is no published guidance for them as to how they should go about doing that. Given the obvious challenges of securing accommodation, not least if you're stuck in a hotel room in Pakistan, Can the Home Secretary say precisely what support her department is providing to this cohort of people who are stuck in Pakistan?
Well, both the ARAP and the ACRS schemes make clear the criteria by which people will be assessed when they are applying to come to the United Kingdom. And I'm very proud that this country and this government has welcomed over 20,000 people under those schemes. Of course, there will be individual cases, and we're happy to consider them. But overall, the scheme has worked well, and thousands of people have benefited from it.
One of the justifications for using former military bases rather than hotels was that it would be a deterrence. We now learn from the Home Office that RF Scampton will not take people from hotels. It might be a detention centre, it might take migrants from Manston. The whole policy is in chaos. Is this why the Home Secretary's own civil servant on the 6th of February recommended to her agree to stop work on proposals on RAF Scampton, agree we should immediately notify the local authority developing proposals for the site? Why has the Home Secretary ignored her own civil servants?
I appreciate very much the efforts of my right honourable friend in standing up for his constituents, and he's doing a fantastic job of doing so. What I would gently say to him is that we have over 40,000 people accommodated in hotels today. We are spending over £6 million a day on that accommodation. It is an unacceptable situation, and that's why the Prime Minister and myself have made it a priority to bring on and deliver alternative, appropriate and more cost-effective accommodation.
Rachel Bassel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem is there are no safe and legal routes. I have children in my constituency who are separated from their parents because they were brought to the UK under the UNHCR scheme, and their parents now cannot come and join them. They've moved from Afghanistan to Pakistan, but they've got no means of coming to be with their children. So why is she keeping families apart as opposed to reuniting families?
I just don't agree with her characterisation. I'm incredibly proud, Mr. Speaker, of the immense generosity the Conservative government, but more importantly, the British people have demonstrated over recent years. We've welcomed over 500,000 people to these shores through safe and legal routes, seeking humanitarian protection. And on top of the country-specific routes, there are non-country-specific routes through which people can apply. The reality is we have millions of people seeking to come here. We have to take a balanced approach. But overall, we have extended the hand of generosity, and we've got a track record of which we can be proud.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Question 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend, the member for Harrow East, is of course a tireless campaigner on this issue, and the whole House, I know, are grateful to him for championing and introducing what is now the Homelessness Reduction Act a few years ago. Mr. Speaker, as we made clear at the time of the passage of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, the government is committed to the repeal of the Vagrancy Act, and as soon as suitable replacement legislation is ready, which we're hoping will be fairly soon, we will introduce that as soon as parliamentary time allows, and at the same time as we do that, we'll repeal the Vagrancy Act.
Bob Blackman.
I thank my honourable friend for that answer. However, more than a year ago, in a vote of both this House and the other place, we agreed to repeal the 1824 Vagrancy Act. Yet it seems as if the Home Office is trying to reintroduce it to deal with aggressive begging. Now, I think the whole House would agree that those people that are street homeless need to be helped and assisted and not arrested. But when will we see the enactment of this Act so the police are be given the powers to help people that are street homeless rather than threaten them?
Well, my honourable friend is of course right that people who are homeless and need assistance should receive that help. I know that our colleagues in DLUHC are working hard to make sure that happens, but we do also need to make sure that members of the public are protected from aggressive or nuisance begging. So where the repeal of the Vagrancy Act leaves lacunae in the law, we do need to make sure those are filled, which is why we're going to repeal the Vagrancy Act once the replacement legislation is ready. And as I said in my first answer, we'll do that as soon as parliamentary time allows.
Oh, Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister for his response and responding to the honourable gentleman and what he has put forward. Homelessness is a scourge and a problem across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and us in Northern Ireland as well. The Minister is known to be a compassionate man and he understands the issue very well. Can I ask what discussions have taken place with the Northern Ireland Assembly in relation to the Big Injury Act to make sure that what happens here will also happen in Northern Ireland to the benefit of our people as well?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, which is asked with his customary courtesy and compassion. We do want to have discussions with the Northern Ireland Executive as soon as they are reformed, which we hope will be soon. We will certainly have those discussions. In relation to England, where of course the government here does have direct responsibility, I'm pleased to tell the House that rough sleeping levels in England are around about 35% lower than they were in 2017, and we look forward to working with our friends and colleagues in Northern Ireland to bring about the same results there.
Question 12, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Countering foreign disinformation which seeks to subvert and undermine the UK's democracy, prosperity and security is vital. The National Security Bill, currently making its way through this House, will further strengthen our ability to counter hostile state threats.
Christian Wakeford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now more than 2 years since the Times reported that Iranian cyber specialists were peddling disinformation in an attempt to influence the results of the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections. That same year, the US Justice Department shut down 36 Iranian-linked websites in a disinformation crackdown. What steps can the Secretary of State lay out for how her own government intends to combat and disrupt the threat of disinformation spread by the murderous Iranian regime here in the UK?
Well, disinformation is the concerted effort to create and deliberately spread false or manipulative information. And the honourable gentleman is right in saying that hostile states such as Iran do use it as a hostile act against the United Kingdom's interests. We are constantly reviewing our position when it comes to Iran, and this is something that we take very seriously at the top of government.
Minister Holland-Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Microsoft's Digital Defence Report outlines how nations including Russia, China and Iran are deploying social media-powered propaganda operations to shape opinion, discredit adversaries and incite fear, with some harrowing examples of Russia's use of hybrid warfare in Ukraine. During the passage of the National Security Bill, the Labour Party called for an annual report into the extent of disinformation originating from foreign powers, something rejected by this government. Does the Home Secretary accept that the government has been far too slow to respond to the scale of this threat, and such a report represents the bare minimum that this government should be doing to protect the UK from foreign and hostile and sustained cyber interference?
Home Secretary.
Well, I disagree again with her characterisation that the government has been too slow to act. In relation to Russian state threats, following the invasion of Ukraine last year, the UK introduced trade sanctions in relation to internet and online media services, which prevented designated entities from using platforms to connect with UK audiences online. And on the 4th of May of this year, the government designated TV Novosti and Rossiya Segdonia, choking off the ability of the Russian Federation to disseminate misinformation across the internet through their state sponsors RT and Sputnik brands. So I think there is a lot of effort, a lot of work that's gone on to counter disinformation posed by the Russian state.
The topical, Siobhan MacDonagh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, Mrs. L. Question number one, Ms.
Mr. Speaker, may I make a topical statement with your permission? Fraud is a despicable crime that accounts for over 40% of all crime in England and Wales. The government's fraud strategy will do far more to block fraud at source, working closely with the private sector and law enforcement. The Online Safety Bill obligates tech platforms to protect users from fraud, and we will consult on banning cold calling for all financial products and clamp down on number spoofing. We will ban devices that let criminals send mass scam texts or disguise their calling number to make scam calls. New powers will take down fraudulent websites. I've told police forces that I want tackling fraud to be a priority. A new national fraud squad with 400 new investigators will go after the worst fraudsters. Mr. Speaker, we will change the law so that more victims of fraud get their money back, and action fraud will be replaced with a state-of-the-art system.
Siobhan MacDonald.
Speaker, my constituents, Mrs L and Mr M, are from Hong Kong and came to the UK on a British national overseas passport. They came to see me because they have been paying into a pension their whole careers and sold their home before coming to the UK. But because of their BNO's visa status, their bank account was frozen at the direction of the Chinese state and in contradiction of Hong Kong law. They are not alone. The Home Office has issued BNO visas to over 160,000 Hong Kongers who have moved to the UK. Does the Home Secretary think it's right that at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party, British national overseas passport holders are being denied access to their own money from their own bank account?
It's topical questions. We've got to be really short. You can't have a full question on topicals, please. I'm sure you've come to the end in the minute. Home Secretary's got a grip of the answer, I'm sure.
I'm very concerned by what the Honourable Lady raises. Obviously, we've welcomed over 100,000 people from Hong Kong via our BNO scheme. We've also had reports and heard from a group of BNOs raising the concerns in the nature that she's raised now. My right honourable friend, the Immigration Minister, and potentially the Security Minister, will get back to her on the details, but I share the concern that she is raising today.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For a long time now, business people in Africa have found it sometimes very difficult to get visas just for very short visits to this country, partly because the system has been centralised and also because there are sometimes very, very small errors on their application. Not only do they lose business, but we also lose business because of this situation. So could the Minister please have a look at it and see what can be done to improve the system?
Well, I'd be very happy to take a further look and to learn from my honourable friend's experience. I am pleased to say that UK VI are now processing all new visit visa applications within the service standard of 15 days, and that amounted to 323,000 applications from those with African nationalities last year.
We come to Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Mr Speaker, on a difficult anniversary, I pay tribute to the brave soldier Lee Rigby and the innocent children, women and men who lost their lives and the many more who were injured at the Manchester Arena, and to their families who remind us of the commitment to never let hatred win. At the heart of the Home Secretary's responsibility is to ensure that laws are fairly enforced for all. But when she got a speeding penalty, it seems she sought special treatment, a private course, and asked civil servants to help. She refused to say what she asked civil servants to do, so I ask her that again, and to also tell us whether she authorised her special advisor to tell journalists that there wasn't a speeding penalty when there was.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I've said earlier, in the summer of last year, I was speeding. I regret that. I paid the fine and I accepted the points. At no time did I seek to avoid the sanction. This is what is serious here is the priorities of the British people. I'm getting on with the job of delivering for the British people a record number of police officers, a plan to stop the boats, and standing up for crime and policing. I only wish the Labour Party would focus on the priorities too.
Yvette Cooper.
Well, the trouble is she's failing to deliver for the British people too. And everyone can see that she isn't answering the basic factual questions on what she said to the civil service and to her special advisor. And it matters because it is her job to show she is abiding by the ministerial code that she's broken before on private and public interests, and to enforce rules fairly for everyone else. But time and again, she tries to think that she's above the normal rules, breaching security even though she's responsible for it, trying to avoid penalties even though she sets them, reappointed even after breaking the ministerial code, and criticising Home Office policies even though she's in charge of them, and is failing on knife crime, on channel crossings, on immigration and more. The Prime Minister is clearly too weak to sort this out. Well, if the Home Secretary cannot get a grip of her own rule-breaking behaviour, how can she get a grip on anything else?
Mr Speaker, some gentle advice for the Right Honourable Lady. The person who needs to get a grip here is the Shadow Home Secretary and the Labour Party, because they have wholly failed to represent the priorities of the British people. When, Mr Speaker, will the Labour Party apologise for campaigning to block the deportation of foreign national offenders? When, Mr Speaker, will the Labour Party apologise for leaving this country with a lower number of police officers?
Can I just say, no responsibility for the Labour Party. I think you might be. Chris Lauder.
Thank you. My friend, the Minister for Immigration, will know that Portland Port, whilst in the constituency of my honourable friend and neighbour for South Dorset, is very close to the constituency border of West Dorset. My constituents in Chickerell and wider West Dorset are becoming increasingly concerned about the absence of knowledge of the risk assessment and the knowledge of the additional resources that will be made available to Dorset Council and Dorset Police, and I wonder if he might be able to share any further information with the House today.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the manner in which he has defended his constituents on this difficult issue, whilst housing asylum seekers in more rudimentary accommodation, such as barges, is undoubtedly in the national interest. We're acutely aware of the challenges faced by the local communities in which they will be moored. That's why we're working closely with Dorset Council, with the honourable gentleman and with the honourable member for Dorset South as well.
SNP spokesperson Alison Poulos.
Speaker, and my heart and that of all on the SNP benches goes out to all of those affected on the anniversary of the Manchester Arena tragedy, but in particular the family and friends of Ailey MacLeod. His memorial trust stands as a legacy to her love of music. Mr Speaker, speeding can affect a person's eligibility for leave to remain in the UK. So shouldn't the same motoring offence and indeed further breaches of the ministerial code by attempting to get special treatment affect the Home Secretary's rights to remain in her job?
As I've said earlier, in the summer I was speeding. I regret that I was speeding. I accepted the points and I paid the fine, and at no point did I seek to avoid the sanction. What I find regrettable, however, is the SNP's wholesale lack to deliver for asylum seekers, to deliver for justice, to deliver for vulnerable people. They're opposing our bill to stop the boats. They're opposing support to break the people smuggling gangs. They're opposing a pragmatic approach.
If the Home Office will ensure that the contracts for the use as asylum hotels of the Rothwell House Hotel Rothwell and the Royal Hotel Kettering are terminated as soon as possible.
I know how strongly my honourable friend feels about this issue. I will, of course, look into those contracts, but the enduring solution to this issue is to stop the boats in the first place, and that's why we brought forward the illegal migration bill.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Turning Point UK have protested 3 times in my constituency in recent months, attempting without success to spread hatred and division in our community. So I'd like to ask the Home Secretary today whether or not she has any concerns about this organisation and how it receives its funding.
I thank the member for that question. Full details should be coming to us to look into that. However, if I can say the government takes hate crime of any sort extremely seriously, which is why we did basic policing. We increased the number of police officers to more than ever before, over 200,000.
Gareth Johnson.
A fundamental right in this country. But that right does not extend to deliberately blocking roads and stopping people going about their daily lives. Therefore, will the Minister support the police if they choose to use their full range of powers to stop those who abuse the right to protest?
Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend. The right to protest emphatically does not extend to trying to ruin or disrupt the lives of fellow citizens who are trying to get to hospital for treatment or get their children to school or get to their place of work. That is why this House recently legislated with the Public Order Act. It's a great shame parties opposite voted against it. This government stands on the side of law-abiding citizens, and we fully support the police in using those powers.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the more the Home Secretary tries to evade the question, the more the British public will conclude that something underhanded and fishy is going on. So can she answer a simple question? Did the Home Secretary ask civil servants to arrange a private speed awareness course?
Yes or no?
As I've made clear, last summer I was speeding and I regret that I was speeding. I was notified of the matter, I paid the fine and I took the points. At no point did anything untoward happen and at no point did I try and avoid the sanction.
Rob Butler.
Is a blight on the lives of too many of my constituents in Aylesbury. And their frustration is often exacerbated because it isn't always clear who can resolve their problems, whether it's the local council or the police, despite the best intentions of both to help. So how can my right honourable friend ensure that people aren't passed from pillar to post, but do have their complaint about bad behaviour tackled swiftly?
Well, my honourable friend is raising a very important issue. The government recently published its antisocial behaviour action plan. My honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and her colleague, the Deluxe Secretary, are jointly chairing a task force to make sure action is taken. We're setting up a number of hotspot patrols around the country to make sure the blight of antisocial behaviour is heavily policed against, and to make sure that where ASB occurs, it is dealt with quickly and thoroughly, and no one is left behind.
Ruth Gabriel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Home Secretary insists on exempting private landlords from minimum housing standards for asylum seekers, this means local councils and fire authorities will not be able to enforce basic safety and overcrowding standards. Doesn't this mean that the worst landlords, instead of improving their properties, will make a fortune from government funding while exploiting vulnerable families and young children who are waiting for years for a decision on their asylum application?
I can assure the honourable lady that our intention is there's no diminution in standards of accommodation, whether that be for asylum seekers or anybody else. But it is absolutely critical that we get those people out of hotels, save the taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds a year, and house asylum seekers in the most appropriate forms of accommodation.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme are rightly appalled by the organised nature of so much immigration crime. So can my right honourable friend set out what work is being done to tackle those groups' operations at source and what impact that is having on the reduction in numbers of arrivals of illegal immigrants?
Well, part of our plan to stop the boats very much focuses on the causal factors like the serious organised immigration crime gangs. They are networked and they are highly resourced. We've had some success in arresting hundreds of people involved in these gangs and disabling several of them. But we are employing more resource to our National Crime Agency, increasing the officers working with the French so that we can clamp down on this problem at cause.
Maureen Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a previous resignation letter, the current Home Secretary wrote, pretending we haven't made mistakes, carrying on as if everyone can't see what we have made them, and hoping things will magically come right is not serious politics. Was she right? And has she made a mistake? Will she accept responsibility? Will she resign?
As I've said earlier, in the summer of last year I was speeding. I regret that I was speeding, and I took the penalty, I paid the penalty and I accepted the points. At no time did I seek to avoid any sanction or consequence.
Question, Crispin Blood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the 56% rise in transphobic hate crime between 2021 and 2022, what does this concern the government, and what strategies are they going to put in place to get this horrifying number down?
Transphobic crimes are hateful, and they actually represent, though people don't realise it, as much as 3% of all hate crimes recorded. The government is determined to stamp out this sort of work, which is why we're funding groups such as True Vision, who are working very hard in this area, and I know the honourable gentleman is working hard too. We're also funding things such as the National Online Hate Hub, which is a central capability designed to allow individuals to have specialist intervention and work. We're also working on education, £3 million of funding between August 2021 and March 2024 to 5 anti-bullying organisations. It's only with better education and the work of the honourable gentleman that we're going to progress in this area.
That completes questions. We now come to the statement on the G7. I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in remembering the victims of the horrific Manchester Arena bombing 6 years ago today. Our thoughts are with them and their families. Our thoughts are also with the family of Lee Rigby on the 10th anniversary of his murder. And I pay tribute to his son Jack, who's honouring his father's memory by raising money for other bereaved military children. As Jack's mum says, Lee would be very proud. Mr. Speaker, I've just returned from the G7 summit in Japan, where I was humbled to be the first Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to visit Hiroshima. On behalf of this House and the British people, I recorded our great sorrow at the destruction and human suffering that occurred there, and our fervent resolve that it should never again be necessary to use nuclear weapons. As I report to the House on the G7 summit, I want to address head-on a mistaken view that is heard too often. The idea that Britain is somehow in retreat on the world stage or that our influence is in decline. I reject that utterly. What we've seen in recent months is this Conservative government delivering the priorities of the British people and bringing our global influence to bear on some of the world's biggest challenges. Nowhere is that clearer than Ukraine. It was a pleasure and privilege to welcome my friend President Zelensky back to the UK last week. His attendance at the G7 summit was a historic moment. When Putin launched his war, he gambled that our resolve would falter. But he was wrong then, and he is wrong now. Russia's military is failing on the battlefield. Their economy is failing at home as we tighten the stranglehold of sanctions. And the image of the G7 leaders standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky in Hiroshima sent a powerful message to the world: we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Of course, we've seen a huge collective effort across our allies, not least the United States. But I'm incredibly proud of our role at the forefront of international support for Ukraine. The first country in the world to train Ukrainian troops. First in Europe to provide lethal weapons. First to commit tanks. And just this month, first to provide long-range weapons. And we've now at the forefront of a coalition to train and equip the Ukrainian Air Force. We gave £2.3 billion in military aid last year, second only to the United States, and will match or exceed that this year. Putin should know that we are not going anywhere. And we know that Ukraine will not only win the war, but can and will win a just and lasting peace, based on respect for international law, the principles of the UN Charter, and territorial integrity and sovereignty. And, Mr. Speaker, we bring that same resolve to the biggest challenge to the long-term security and prosperity of our age, China. As the G7 showed, the UK's response is completely aligned with our allies. We are working with others to strengthen our defence ties across the Indo-Pacific, diversify our supply chains in areas like critical minerals and semiconductors, and prevent China using economic coercion to interfere with the sovereignty of others. Concrete actions, not rhetoric. But our economic security is not just about managing the risks of China, Mr. Speaker. We're taking advantage of our post-Brexit freedoms with a hugely ambitious trade policy. We've concluded negotiations on the CPTPP, a trade deal with the world's fastest-growing region. We've signed critical mineral partnerships with Canada and Australia, a semiconductor partnership with Japan. The Windsor Framework secures the free flow of trade within our UK internal market. And on Friday, we announced almost £18 billion of new investment into the UK from Japanese businesses. That's a huge vote of confidence in the United Kingdom, creating significant numbers of good, well-paid jobs and helping grow the economy. And, Mr. Speaker, we're acting globally to tackle illegal migration. It is the British government who will determine who comes to Britain. We must stop the boats and break the business model of the criminal gangs. To do that, we're deepening international cooperation to tackle illegal migration through new deals with Albania, France, and just at last week's Council of Europe, starting with the EU Border Force 2. And at this weekend's summit, we've secured agreement that we will increase G7 cooperation too. So, Mr. Speaker, our foreign policy is clearly delivering for the British people. By strengthening our relationships with old friends and new, from the Indo-Pacific to Washington to Europe, we're delivering a diplomatic dividend for the UK. And that's not all. We've announced billions more for our defence, the largest contributor in Europe to NATO. We signed a historic agreement to design and build the AUKUS submarine, giving the UK, Australia and the US interoperable submarine fleets in the Atlantic and the Pacific. We've launched a new programme to build the fighter jets of the future with Italy and Japan. Announced that in 2025 the carrier strike group will return to the Indo-Pacific once more. And in Sudan, the British military completed the largest evacuation of any country. And if anyone thinks the UK is no longer able to wield hard power in defence of our values, just ask the Ukrainian soldiers driving British tanks or firing our long-range missiles. All that, Mr. Speaker, is how we will prosper at home and defend our values abroad. That's how our foreign policy is delivering for the British people. And that's why, on the world stage, Britain is forging ahead, confident, proud and free. And I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, and can I join with him in his comments in remembering the victims of the Manchester Arena bombing and in marking the awful murder of Lee Rigby. Mr. Speaker, the war in Ukraine is entering a critical stage. Freedom must win out over tyranny, and Putin's aggression must fail. As the Ukrainians continue to defend themselves and prepare for an offensive to push Putin's forces out, it is crucial they know the nations of the G7 continue to support their fight without waver. We will stand with them for as long as it takes. We will stand with them because their decisive victory is the route to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Therefore, Labour welcomes the strong show of support for President Zelensky. We welcome the decision by our partners on F-16 fighter jets. We also welcome restrictions on exports that aid the Russian war machine. And we welcome the tightening of the vice on the mineral trade that is funding Putin's aggression. I would urge the Prime Minister to prescribe the Wagner Group as terrorists and to ensure Britain's sanctions are not just in place but enforced. No one has been fined for breaching sanctions since the war began. Mr. Speaker, as I told President Zelensky when I met him in Kyiv, whichever party is in power in the UK, there will be no let-up in Britain's resolve. We will continue to support Ukraine's military and its people in their quest for freedom, for peace and for justice. And when their moment of victory comes, we will be there to help them rebuild from the rubble of war. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that when it comes to Ukraine, it is important that we continue to show that we are united across this House? Mr. Speaker, I also welcome the commitment to de-risk our economic relationship with China. It is in our national interest to engage with China. They will be crucial global partners in the effort to reach net zero, and we have a trading relationship worth £100 billion. But that pursuit should never come at the cost of economic security, and we should never leave ourselves vulnerable to economic coercion. We must be clear-eyed about the facts. China is increasingly aggressive in the Pacific. They show disdain for democratic values and human rights, and they are seeking to exploit economic leverage. A decade of ignoring these facts and Tory governments cosing up to Beijing have gifted the Chinese Communist Party a stake in Britain's key infrastructure. We need to change tack, and Labour is willing to work with the government on this. It is time for a full audit of UK-China relations and to work more consistently with our allies to develop a long-term plan for Western engagement and a long-term plan for economic security. Because, as this winter has shown us, in the modern world, economic security is national security. As the world races to invest in new technologies and to make their supply chains more robust, we must make sure British businesses can take advantage. The Prime Minister has rightly pointed out the importance of the semiconductor industry. They are the brains of our electronic devices, indispensable components of cutting-edge manufacturing. The US and the EU have big plans to grow and nurture their sectors, to remove any vulnerabilities from their supply chains. Now, we've waited a long time for the UK to present its strategy. It finally arrived last week, and an industry leader described it as frankly flaccid. Does that worry the Prime Minister as much as it worries me? Whilst others build resilience and seize opportunities, this government seems content with managed decline. And this isn't the only area where I fear we're being left behind. The US and the EU used the G7 to continue important talks that would allow European companies to share in billions of dollars of US tax incentives for electric vehicles and green technologies, and vice versa. Last week, we saw warnings about the future of the UK car industry. People who work in the sector are very worried. They want leadership. So can the Prime Minister confirm his government will secure the same or better access for British manufacturers, and when can we expect to hear progress on this? When the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the government's response wasn't to outline what opportunities this offered to Britain. It was to say it was dangerous and to suggest that an active industrial strategy is somehow not the British way. Wake up. It's not the 1980s anymore. A race is on. We need to be in it, and we need to win our share of the jobs of the future. We can't afford to be stuck in the changing rooms complaining about how unfair life is. Mr. Speaker, as the war in Europe continues to rage, Hiroshima was a fitting stage for the G7 summit. A city which has seen unimaginable horrors has risen from its past. It can serve as an inspiration for those in Ukraine who fight daily for their freedom. Their future can be bright. From Ukraine to China to climate change, today's challenges are big, but if we stay united with our allies and partners, if we work together, they are not insurmountable. And if we're focused, if we have a plan, the economic opportunities of the future are bigger still. Britain must seize them with both hands, and our future can be bright too. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments at the beginning with regard to Ukraine. Just with regard to the Wagner Group, we have already sanctioned the Wagner Group in its entirety, and we don't, as a routine matter, comment on prescriptions, as he well knows. With regard to sanctions, in April we announced new sanctions targeting those who were aiding and abetting the evasion of sanctions on Russian oligarchs, and in the integrated review refresh we announced £50 million over the next few years for a new economic deterrence initiative that will work on sanctions enforcement and compliance in cooperation with our allies. With regard to China, he asked about our approach and clarifying it to China. That was done. He may have missed it in the integrated review refresh. It was spelt out clearly and indeed warmly welcomed by not just foreign policy commentators in the UK, but internationally around the world, and has been mentioned to me specifically by leaders and statesmen from many different countries as a template that they have followed in their own national security strategies. With regard to cooperation with our allies, again, that is something that is already happening, and we are leading the way, Mr. Speaker. He may have missed that the G7 communique launched a cooperation platform on economic coercion, something that we spoke about in our integrated review refresh, and now that has been brought to fruition, which will be a cooperation not just of G7 allies, but will over time be broadened beyond to ensure that we are working together to combat countries when they attempt to coerce other countries economically. With regard to his final comments on the economy, Mr. Speaker, and climate change. And he points out these various points on climate change and the G7's record. What he failed to mention is out of all the G7 countries, the country which has the best record on reducing climate emissions is the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. So it's very welcome that other countries are catching up with our record on climate change, Mr. Speaker. We applaud them, and it's something that we have fought very hard for them to do. So it is now great that they are doing. And I won't mention his other points, just to say that we do have a different point of view. We do not believe that the way to drive economic success and prosperity is to subsidise the most, Mr. Speaker. That is not the route that will lead to the best outcomes. And indeed, that was something that the G7 themselves acknowledged. Again, I would point him to the language in the communiqué that particularly warned against subsidy races and pointing out that they were a zero-sum game, Mr. Speaker, when they come at the expense of others. And actually, we should be working cooperatively as we are. And lastly, for all his negative talk, Mr. Speaker, the proof is in the simple fact. On Friday, we announced £18 billion of new investment into the UK economy from a range of leading Japanese businesses. They have enormous faith and confidence in the United Kingdom. Why doesn't he?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I applaud the Prime Minister's recognition that the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest threat we face and that we must de-risk in order to keep our people safe. We will engage when in the global interest, but we cannot allow the Chinese Communist Party to cast defence as escalation. So can I urge my right honourable friend to consider 3 tests when it comes to de-risking? The first is transnational oppression. We must be strong at home if we wish to deter abroad. The second is techno-authoritarianism. We must prevent reliance on CCP technology that is stealing our data and will undermine us. And finally, we must uphold the international rules-based system because they are trying to undermine and to capture it. Finally, can I also urge the creation of an economic Rammstein on Ukraine that mirrors that of the military, because we have failed to suffocate the financial war machine that is allowing Putin to continue with this war. And he can lead that with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and it would make a meaningful difference and end this war sooner.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for her questions, but also her work on these issues in particular. With regard to her latter question, we just at the G7 announced more sanctions, particularly targeting the military-industrial complex of Russia's war machine, which I think will go some way to addressing her concerns and point. But of course, there's more to do, and we will look forward to engaging with her on it. With regard to China, I think her points are all very well made. I look forward to discussing with her how we can strengthen the new anti-coercion platform that we've established. It's something that I know she's talked about in the past, and where we, working with other countries, can make an enormous difference to more vulnerable nations' ability to stand up to economic coercion, whether it comes from China or other hostile states.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would, of course, begin by echoing the sentiments of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in relation to the Manchester bombing and, of course, the appalling death of Lee Rigby so many years ago. Mr. Speaker, the symbolic importance of the G7 summit taking place in Hiroshima goes without question. So too does the importance of the presence of President Zelensky in Japan. It goes without saying that Ukraine's war and their fight for democracy is our fight too, and all of us on these benches and across this House are fully united in our support for the President and indeed the people of Ukraine. In order for Ukraine to be successful, however, we need unity amongst all of those nations who believe in peace. In that regard, can I ask the Prime Minister whether he had any conversations with those nations who still are at this moment in time importing crude oil from Russia, and indeed whether he expressed any concern about other nations who may well be benefiting from products that have been derivative from that crude oil itself. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, in relation to China, we did of course hear strong words from the G7 in relation to that situation. However, I'm quite intrigued by the Instagram intervention of the former Prime Minister. I would be grateful for the current Prime Minister's view in respect to whether that was helpful and whether he agrees with her that China poses a strategic threat to the UK, and whether he would echo those sentiments. And finally, Mr. Speaker, In terms of the economy, it would be remiss of me not to reflect upon the fact that the UK has the lowest growth in the entire G7. Our economy is still below pre-pandemic levels. In contrast, the likes of the United States has seen their economy grow by around 5.3% in the intervening time. Does the Prime Minister, and did he, take any lessons from those allies in Japan about how to secure proper economic growth?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on China, our approach is laid out in detail in the integrated review refresh. I reiterated it yesterday and I won't go over it again, but China, as I said, represents a systemic challenge. It's the greatest challenge we face. In fact, I said it's an epoch-defying challenge given its both ability and intent to reshape the world order, and its behaviour is increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad, which is why we should be robust in defending and protecting ourselves against that. On sanctions, we are working in tandem with the European Union and the US to intensify diplomatic engagement with third country partners to highlight potential circumvention risks on sanctions, and will continue to do so. And more generally, on the question of peace and discussing with partner countries, it was excellent to have a discussion on Ukraine and peace with partner countries outside of the G7. I think perhaps one of the most meaningful sessions of the summit, where countries agreed to the principles of a just and lasting peace being based on the UN Charter and indeed on the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty. That is very welcome, Mr. Speaker, because whilst many people may have ideas of what peace in Ukraine looks like, a ceasefire is not a just and durable peace. And we will keep ensuring that the peace that Ukraine has is one that it deserves and one that is truly just and lasting.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome the statement and the work of the Prime Minister at the G7. We are rightly rekindling those international statecraft skills as we see in Ukraine, going from NLAWs to main battle tanks, training on Salisbury Plain, the Storm Shadows, and of course helping secure those F-16s. And with China, a more robust language as we deal with China's aggression. But of course, as we rightly step forward, this will place an ever greater burden on our armed forces. I think he knows where I'm going with this. Could I ask him when we're likely to see an increase in the defence budget to 2.5% GDP?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend is long championed for this, and rightly so, which is why I was pleased as Chancellor to increase our defence budget by £24 billion, the largest sustained increase since the end of the Cold War. Just recently, my honourable friend, the Chancellor, added an additional £5 billion of spending over the next 2 years to both strengthen our nuclear enterprise and to rebuild stockpiles, which is something I know he has been interested in the past. And we outlined an ambition to increase defence spending to 2.5%. We're on track to get to 2.25 in the next couple of years, at which point we will take stock and see where we are economically and fiscally. But as I said, the threats our country faces are increasing, and it's right that we invest appropriately to protect ourselves.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the victims of the Manchester Arena bombing and the family of Fuseli Rigby? Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's update. He's right that the UK and our allies must be steadfast in our support for the Ukraine. He's also right to announce new sanctions on Friday to further restrict Russian businesses from selling their products into the UK. Now we must take further action to support Ukraine. That includes encouraging individuals in this country who are directly invested in companies still active in Russia to sell their personal shares now. Does the Prime Minister agree that these people should end their investment so they stop supporting the Russian economy and thereby Putin's war efforts?
Mr. Speaker, we were one of the first countries to put in place an incredibly comprehensive sanctions regimes against Russia. We have sanctioned at this point over 1,500 people, tens of billions of dollars of assets, and indeed, because of our actions, something like over $200 billion worth of Russian state assets are currently now frozen. All of that is contributing to a significant squeezing of the Russian economy, as we're seeing, and their ability to replenish their war machine. And we will keep looking for other opportunities to tighten the vice, as we did this weekend.
Dr. Sir Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If, against all original expectations, Ukraine succeeds in expelling Russia from her territory, will the time then have come for us seriously to consider admitting Ukraine to NATO so that no future psychopathic Russian leader will ever be tempted to invade her again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the NATO Secretary-General has already said, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. The most immediate task that faces us is, as my honourable friend knows, to provide the support Ukraine needs to be successful on the battlefield, but also to provide the longer-term security agreements and arrangements that Ukraine deserves. To do that in a way that is multilateral, that's something I discussed with leaders across the G7, because in doing so we will send a strong signal to Russia that we are not going anywhere, increase the long-term deterrent effect, but also strengthen the incentive for them to withdraw their troops now and not attempt to wait anybody out.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many people in Newport West have been eagerly waiting for the government's semiconductor strategy, including 600 hard-working employees at Newport Wafer Fab. But after 3 years of waiting, rather than coming to this House, the Prime Minister made the announcement in Japan on Friday last week, avoiding parliamentary scrutiny yet again. That is unacceptable in my view. How can we expect effective R&D to be carried out within the semiconductor industry as trumpeted by the strategy without well-funded domestic manufacturing capacity?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady Mayor missed the £1 billion of investment in the UK semiconductor industry contained in the strategy. The fact that it was welcomed by leading companies from the sector, it has taken the right amount of time to get the strategy together because it is the right strategy for Britain, Mr. Speaker. Every country has different strengths. Every country plays different role in the supply chain. We are focused on what we do best, which is in compound semiconductors, which you will know well from South Wales, but also semiconductor design and IP. Those are the strengths that we're investing in, which give us leverage in a very large global supply chain, which is why it was warmly welcomed, and it's the right strategy to strengthen our security.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, among the many other achievements this weekend, can I thank the Prime Minister for ensuring that education did not drop off the global agenda and that the communiqué reaffirms the G7's commitment to global education. This is an issue that we, the UK, have led on for many years. There are over 200 million children in the world right now who are in need of urgent educational support. It's been made worse by conflict and by climate change. So could I urge my right honourable friend for him to continue to encourage our friends, particularly France and Japan, to contribute to Education Cannot Wait?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for all her work in this area previously, and she will be, as I am, proud that the Foreign Secretary launched the Women and Girls strategy in March, and one of the particular things in that was to continue putting women and girls at the heart of everything to do with, particularly with regard to education, and UK aid has supported 8 million girls to gain a decent education, all part of our pledge to enable all girls to have access to 12 years of high-quality education. It's something that we will continue to champion in all international fora.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I declare an interest as Chair of the International Parliamentary Network on the World Bank and the IMF, but can I also welcome the commitment in paragraph 10 of the G7 communiqué to enhance development finance to tackle the imminent debt crisis, tackle climate change and advance progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Wouldn't that be an awful lot easier if the UK actually stepped up and met the African Development Bank's calls for hybrid capital, matched Japan's commitment to share 40% of the new special drawing rights, and use the €3.5 billion we get back from the European Investment Bank to actually help now build a bigger World Bank? At a stroke, that would help restore the global leadership in development that we have so needlessly and dangerously squandered.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman failed to mention that we are currently the third largest spender in the G7 on development aid as a percentage of GDP. We're one of the largest contributors to funds like the Global Fund and indeed the multilateral institutions that he named. So we have everything to be proud of. When it comes to reform, as we discussed at the G7, and I began that work as Chancellor, we are pushing for reform of the multilateral development bank so that we can stretch their balance sheet. We are also pioneering the work of using climate resilient debt clauses in our bilateral lending. funding. That was a specific ask from the development finance community that we are taking forward, and indeed the common framework for debt relief, which is something I know he will be familiar with. Again, as Chancellor, I put that common framework in place, and we're now working hard to deliver benefits of that to countries. And with SDRs, when I announced it, we were the first country to announce we would recycle our SDRs. That's having an enormous difference. Every country contributes in different ways, but we should be very proud of our record.
So, Benedict.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend for putting Ukraine at front and centre of this G7 summit? And can he make clear that this is not just because we believe it is morally right to support Ukraine in her own self-defence, but because the successful outcome of the war in Ukraine is absolutely intrinsically tied up with our own strategic and national interests and that of the whole Western world upon which our own security and prosperity depends.
My honourable friend put it very well, and I agree with every word he says, and I would go slightly further as well. Ultimately, what are we fighting for? We're fighting for the values that we believe in, of democracy, of freedom, of the rule of law. And my honourable friend, the only thing I disagree with him on is he said the Western world. And actually, what has been striking and welcome in this conflict has been the support of countries like Japan. And I paid enormous tribute to Prime Minister Kishida in Hiroshima for that leadership, because they have recognised rightly, as have other countries like Australia and other allies, that our security is indivisible. Whether in the Pacific or the Euro-Atlantic, the values that we all hold dear are universal, and we should all work together and fight hard to defend them.
Williams. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The semiconductor partnership with Japan is very welcome indeed. But the Prime Minister mentioned some domestic investments to my honourable friend from Newport East a moment ago. That £1 billion, I understand, is focused entirely on research. Is he similarly committed to manufacturing, for example, at Newport, or is he happy to leave that to Taiwan, the United States, and of course to the European Union?
Mr. Speaker, what we are focused on is growing our semiconductor industry and making sure we are resilient against future shocks. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can do that. Indeed, we just signed a new semiconductor deal, as acknowledged, with Japan, and we will continue to find opportunities to do that with others. But the idea that we could insource a global manufacturing supply chain into the UK is simply not right. What we should do is focus on our strengths, and we will support manufacturing where it makes sense, and in particular in compound manufacturing, the capital intensity is far less than it is in more basic fabs and chips. So we've got a strategy that works for the UK strengths, particularly works for South Wales, and I'm very confident that it will be successful.
Sir Edward Lee.
The Prime Minister quite rightly mentioned illegal migration. It would be good to hear what the G7 is proposing to deal with it, particularly in terms of cooperation by our French allies. But the truth is that legal migration dwarfs anything from illegal migration. In the last 20 years, the population of the UK has increased by 8 million, of which 7 million are from illegal migrants. So what is the Prime Minister going to do to back up the Home Office in making serious efforts to stop legal migration, which is changing the country forever, which is totally unsustainable, and which we have promised to deal with again and again?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend could probably imagine that wasn't a topic of conversation around the table in Hiroshima, but what I can tell him is I am committed, and the government is committed, to bringing down the levels of legal migration. With regard to illegal migration, cooperation with allies is something that is yielding tangible benefits for the UK. He talked about France. The new deal with France strengthens physical cooperation of French forces on the ground. It also strengthens cooperation and intelligence sharing. At the Council of Europe last week, we just opened up conversations to work more closely with Frontex, the EU's border agency, and Italy will make sure that illegal migration is a specific topic mentioned and discussed and worked on in next year's G Summit under their presidency, and I will continue to raise it in all the international fora where I'm present.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister mentioned, President Zelensky attended the G7 summit. One thing that I understand is important to him is that Ukrainian culture has an audience across the world. Yet there are concerns that musicians from the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra and the National Symphony Orchestra of Ukraine will not be able to tour to the UK later this year because of the heavy financial and administrative burden of obtaining UK visas. The Prime Minister will understand that funding visa fees and travelling to obtain the visas is so much more difficult for musicians in war-torn Ukraine. Last year, the Home Office agreed to waive visa fees and expedite the visa process to allow Ukrainian musicians to perform here. Does the Prime Minister agree that Ukrainian musicians still deserve this support, and will he ask the Home Secretary to ensure that we do offer this support as we stand with Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with regard to Ukrainian culture in particular, it was a great pleasure for us to host Eurovision on Ukraine's behalf, which is a fantastic success and warmly welcomed by the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky. I'm happy to look into the matter that she raised, but as she will understand, our overwhelming priority right now is to support Ukraine to ensure that their counter-offensive is successful, and that will occupy the bulk of our attention.
Ms Grelly.
Mr. Speaker, clearly the move towards onshoring or nearshoring key strategic products is sensible. We saw why that's so necessary during the pandemic and with other issues around. But there does seem to be a tendency to turn a natural, logical, strategic need for nearshoring key products into protectionism across the developed world. What discussions took place about that issue at the G7, and what can my right honourable friend do to make sure we do not revert to a protectionist world and abandon the benefits of free trade?
Excellent question. Prime Minister.
So my right honourable friend makes an excellent point, and he can rest assured that I raised exactly that point with my colleagues in Hiroshima. He will be pleased, as I was, that there is language in the G7 communique which commits all G7 countries not to act at each other's expense and not to do so in a way that is zero-sum competition. But he's absolutely right to identify the risk. Other countries acknowledge it, which is why the G7 communique is strong on this point, and going forward you will see much greater cooperation between allies so that we don't engage in protectionism, which is not something that will drive prosperity and growth in any of our countries.
Joe Jose.
Speaker, can I welcome what the Prime Minister said about China, particularly his intention to diversify our supply chains in areas like critical minerals. But the Prime Minister knows China probably mines around 70% of all rare earth minerals and produces around 90% of all processed global rare earth minerals. So what investments is he planning to support in order to ensure there is capacity anywhere in the world to stop companies in the UK and elsewhere being required to buy from China?
Here. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, we are strengthening investment here at home and increasingly playing our part in the critical mineral cycling chain, particularly with regard to recycling, which is a key part of how we can ensure long-term sustainability, and it's an area where there's enormous growth opportunity in the UK, and we are investing directly in that. As he'll know, we've just signed critical minerals agreements with Japan and Australia, with more to come as I continue conversations with other leaders. But in particular, our new economic coercion unit that is being established will work to ensure that China is not able to exert undue influence on those countries which do possess critical minerals, to ensure that they can trade those minerals freely and fairly.
Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I should declare that I have the honour to be the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Japan. Next week marks the 30th anniversary of the opening by the then Prince Charles of Toyota's manufacturing plant in Derbyshire. It's been a tremendous asset for both of our countries. Does the Prime Minister agree that in a turbulent world, in which, as my right honourable friend says, protectionism is on the rise, our two countries, Japan and the UK, are more like-minded than ever, even more than at that time? So will he commit to work very closely with Japan to manufacture the next generation of cars, as well as new technologies from offshore wind to satellites and AI?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his appointment? I know he'll do a superb job, and I agree with him. And as the recent Hiroshima Accords say, I think the relationship between the UK and Japan is the strongest that it has ever been across all areas, whether it's scientific collaboration,
trade and economic growth, or indeed security, the partnership is strong, and the recent accords that we have signed will take it to an even greater level of depth and cooperation. On the particular issue of auto manufacturing, I was pleased to meet the president of Nissan while I was in Tokyo, who had also recently met with the Chancellor, and as he can see from the announcements, there is confidence in the UK economy, and will continue to work very closely with Japanese automakers to ensure investment in the UK and that we can make the next generation of electric vehicles here.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister did finally mention climate change in his response to the Leader of the Opposition, but in fact this G7 summit was a disaster for the climate, flying in the face of expert warnings that if we're serious about staying below 1.5 degrees, there can be no new exploration of oil and gas. And whilst the communiqué did acknowledge the new fund for loss and damage, it failed to deliver any new funding into it. Now, Oxfam has estimated that the G7 owes the Global South a staggering $8.7 trillion for the harm already caused by their excessive carbon emissions. So will the Prime Minister now lead the way on that fund in particular and commit to new and additional funding specifically for loss and damage in advance of the COP28 summit?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady obviously missed the fact that this was the first time there was a G7 commitment to stop building new coal plants. It was the first time there was a G7 collective renewable energy target, and it confirmed that the developed countries would meet their commitment to provide $100 billion in climate finance per annum, something that has been warmly welcomed. But again, I would point her back to what I said to the Leader of the Opposition. She failed to point out that of all the G7 countries, we have the best record on reducing climate emissions.
Michael Fabricant.
As the Prime Minister knows, it is Putin's wish and Ukraine's fear that the conflict goes long and battle fatigue will set in. Now, my right honourable friend has been very clear, as has the Leader of the Opposition, that we will give that long-term support. But what was his assessment of his colleagues whom he met at the G7, and particularly countries like India, which haven't always shown full commitment to the struggle currently in Ukraine?
Well, as I pointed out earlier, the session with partner countries that have been invited, including India, Brazil, Australia, and others, was very good in confirming support for a just and durable peace in Ukraine. With regard to his first point, he makes an excellent observation, and that's why we have been working hard with other countries to put in place bilateral and multilateral long-term security arrangements. It's something that I've long discussed with President Zelensky and have spoken to other leaders about, because my belief is that if we can put some kind of long-term multilateral security arrangement in place as soon as possible, it will show to President Putin that we are not going away, and that there is no point in trying to wait us out, because Ukraine will get long-term support to defend itself, not just last year and this year and next year, but for years to come. That is an important thing for us to do, and he can rest assured that I will continue having those conversations and pushing that point with our allies all the way in the run-up to Vilnius summit.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's #1 priority should be to strengthen the resilience of our economy so that we can stand more firmly on our own 2 feet in this dangerous and turbulent world. It was disappointing, therefore, that in his statement he failed to make any reference to the central role that steel plays, a key industry that builds our economic and national security and resilience. So with China and the US and EU governments investing hundreds of billions of pounds in their steel industry, can he set out what steps his government is taking to ensure that we build this vital building block of our manufacturing base?
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to supporting the UK steel industry. He knows full well that I can't comment on discussions that are happening of a commercially sensitive nature with particular companies, but he will know our track record, and I, as Chancellor during the pandemic, provided financial support to a steel company in South Wales because I believed it was the right thing to do. So if he needs any evidence of our commitment to steel industry, particularly in Wales, he doesn't need to look too far.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for his stance on Ukraine and for successful G7? He rightly mentioned this afternoon the problem of mass immigration, particularly illegal immigration. Without doubt, one of the aggravating factors is the EU's open border policy. Was there any discussion to relook at that?
Prime Minister.
As said, no discussion as you might expect at the G7, but illegal migration was discussed at the Council of Europe last week when I was there, and as he can see, we started conversations with the EU about closer cooperation with the EU's border agency, Frontex. So we can work together to work upstream, share intelligence, and make sure that we break the cycle of the criminal gangs, and he can expect further conversations and cooperation in that vein, because ultimately this is a shared challenge. Illegal migration was up 50 to 60% in the European continent last year, so we're not alone in facing this challenge, and we will work with others to constructively solve it.
Drew Hendry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Wagner Group have already admitted to murdering 40 children and hundreds of adults sheltering in a basement in Bakhmut. Mere sanctions are not a strong enough message. What does they have to do before the Prime Minister will take action to prescribe this terrorist organisation?
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we are also doing is making sure that those that commit war crimes in Ukraine will be held accountable and will be brought to justice, which is why we took a leading role in supporting evidence gathering, providing financial and technical legal support, recently over £1 million to these efforts, and very much welcomed the recent announcement of the ICC to bring to justice war crimes that have been committed, particularly against children, and will continue to play a leading part in the coalition to ensure that those who do commit these crimes are brought to justice.
James Morris.
Deputy Speaker, the global environment faces more challenges than it has for many years, not least existential threats to the rules-based international order and also threats to the essence of our democratic values. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that actually the UK is uniquely placed to build the networks and relationships that are needed in order to stop those threats from becoming a reality?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and we are uniquely placed, and I think the last few months of our international engagement and diplomacy has shown that we have strong relationships not just in the United States but across Europe and increasingly in the Indo-Pacific as well. All those relationships are strengthening our security both at home and abroad and delivering real benefits for the British people.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister mentioned the United Nations in the context of his remarks about Ukraine, and he'll obviously be aware the United Nations has quite rightly condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Could he make any comment on the calls made by General Secretary Guterres to attempt to negotiate a ceasefire supported by President Ramaphosa and supported by the Pope? And what comment would he make about the statement made this morning by President Lula of Brazil? He's right that a ceasefire is not peace, but any peace process has to be started by a ceasefire. Otherwise, this war will go on and get worse and worse.
Prime Minister.
I could not disagree with the honourable gentleman more, Madam Deputy Speaker. A ceasefire is not a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Russia has conducted an illegal and unprovoked invasion of another country. It has committed heinous war crimes, and the right and only response to that is for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. And all plans masquerading as peace plans that are in fact attempts just to freeze the conflict where it is are absolutely wrong, and they should be called out for exactly that.
May I congratulate my right honourable friend for the substantive and central role he played at the G7 summit and the important progress made in advancing the G7 agenda of growing importance to our security and our economy. What is his assessment of how far India is now moving to share this agenda, not least in its relations with Russia?
Sir.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as said, the session with partner countries, including India and others, was positive in its conversation on Ukraine and also on the principles of what a just and lasting peace would look like. And it should be one that is based on the principles of the UN Charter and the territorial integrity being respected of countries and indeed their sovereignty. Those are principles which we believe in, those are principles on which the United Nations was founded on, and those are the principles on which peace in Ukraine should be brought about.
Mari Rimmer.
Deputy Speaker.
Did the Prime Minister have any success in convincing countries such as India and Brazil to take a stronger stance against Russia's invasion and partial occupation of the Ukraine? Prime Minister.
Well, indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the benefits of President Zelensky attending the G7 summit was the ability for him to talk directly to these leaders as he did so, particularly in the session, but in other conversations. It was a very powerful message that he could deliver in person, and I hope that message will go around the world and people saw the symbolism that it represented. And as we see, over 140 countries have condemned Russia in the United Nations. They remain largely isolated on the global stage, and we continue to bring others to the cause.
Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK's key role in G7 Tokyo decisions highlights the fact that this government is doing more on the world stage, not retreating from it, especially in the Indo-Pacific region and Southeast Asia, where I had the honour to serve as the Prime Minister's trade envoy. In his talks with President Jokowi of Indonesia, the largest member state in ASEAN and, of course, current ASEAN chair, does my right honourable friend agree with me that in this last year of President Jokowi's term of office, this is a good time for both our countries to scope out the will and capacity for a wide-ranging bilateral free trade agreement?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for all the work he does to promote our trade in the region and strengthen our relationships with countries like Indonesia. I did discuss his particular missives in person with President Jokowi, and we had a good conversation on how we can strengthen our trading relationship, not least through the JETCO, which we already have, and looking forward to build on that in the future.
Patrick Grady.
Deputy Speaker, if it's the Prime Minister's fervent resolve that it should never again be necessary to use nuclear weapons, why is he spending billions of pounds renewing Trident?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, look, of course, on this issue, we'll disagree with the Scottish Nationalist Party, but we do remain committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we are signatory along with 190 other countries. That offers us the best tool available to bring about eventual global disarmament, but that will have to be step by step. It will have to be a negotiated approach, because we have to recognise the escalating security threats that we face and the role that our nuclear deterrent plays in keeping us safe.
Matt Warman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Qualcomm, Graphcore and ARM are among the major semiconductor manufacturers that welcomed the UK's semiconductor strategy. The Prime Minister is right to focus on where we are best and where we can play an outsized role in this industry. At its heart, however, this is also about lessening our dependence on Taiwan. Can the Prime Minister assure me and the House that lessening our semiconductor dependence on Taiwan will not come with greater risk of seeing a decrease in relations between China and Taiwan?
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his comments on the semiconductor strategy. Of course, it's an area that he speaks with authority on. Our long-standing policy on Taiwan has not changed. We have a clear interest in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and will completely resist any unilateral attempts to change the status quo. And we continue to have deep and growing ties in a wide range of areas with Taiwan, whether it's on economic, trade, cultural or educational matters.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister spent time at the G7 dealing with reports that his Home Secretary may have breached the ministerial code. Would the Prime Minister take the opportunity to update the House as to whether he has yet met with his independent adviser, whether there will now be an investigation into whether the ministerial code has been broken, and to confirm that if the Home Secretary has breached the ministerial code, she will be sacked?
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can confirm that was not a topic of conversation at the G7 summit. But in the interest of being generous, I've always been clear that where issues like this are raised, they should be dealt with properly and they should be dealt with professionally. Since I've returned from the G7, I have been receiving information on the issues raised. I have met with both the independent adviser and the Home Secretary. I've asked for further information, and I'll update on the appropriate course of action in due course.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the £18 billion of new Japanese investment for the UK. And will my right honourable friend confirm that he will be working to ensure as much of that investment comes to businesses in Stoke-on-Trent and that we can grow the number of well-skilled, well-paid jobs in Stoke-on-Trent?
My honourable friend is a fantastic champion for Stoke and his constituents, and the great news about this investment, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is coming in a range of different industries, which means all parts of the UK, I'm confident, will benefit, whether it's in auto manufacturing or indeed clean energy or the industries of the future like quantum and semiconductors. There are fantastic opportunities, and ultimately that's why our international diplomacy is working. It's delivering concrete benefits and jobs for people here at home.
Jonathan Edwards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the sanctions strategy against Russia is being undermined by so-called leakage to other countries. For instance, Russian oil exports to India have reportedly increased substantially, a point I suspect President Zelensky would have made to Prime Minister Modi during their discussions at the summit. Did the Prime Minister make similar points during his bilateral talks with Prime Minister Modi?
As I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, the G7 allies are working in tandem to intensify diplomatic engagement with third country partners to highlight potential sanction circumvention risks, and we also, as I said, are investing £50 million in a new economic deterrence initiative which will back up our own sanctions implementation and enforcement.
Henry Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for leading discussions at the G7 in Hiroshima on countering and guarding against the national security threats that are coming from China. In that vein, will he consider blocking companies like BGI who are harvesting genomic data like they have done in the United States and they have done in terms of academia in Canada from activities in this country?
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, our new National Security Investment Bill gives us the powers to block hostile investment into sensitive sectors. He will know that we have used the powers in that bill to block Chinese investment in Newport wafer fab, for example. We obviously look at every transaction on a case-by-case basis, but we now have one of the most robust frameworks anywhere in the world for protecting our companies and our intellectual property from foreign interference and theft.
Richard Ford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Liberal Democrats welcome those parts of the Prime Minister's statement that relates to Ukraine. But I'd like to take that a little bit further and ask him about Russian misinformation. President Biden said of the supply of F-16 fighter aircraft that he has received assurances that the fighter jets will not be used to, quote, go on and move into Russia. President Macron said something similar in relation to the supply of French weapons, but misinformation abounds from the Kremlin about NATO's intentions. Is the Prime Minister prepared, like the Presidents of the United States and France, to talk about how British long-range missiles are limited to targets in Ukraine for the liberation of Ukraine?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Defence Secretary has already made clarifications around our use of Storm Shadow, but we should all remember what Ukraine is engaged in is self-defence, and indeed NATO itself is a self-defence alliance. Ukraine has faced an illegal and unprovoked act of aggression and invasion from Russia, and we should be able to give them all means necessary to defend themselves against those attacks.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I very much thank the Prime Minister for his statement and support for Ukraine on behalf of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the Prime Minister has very clearly shown that his words become action, and for that we thank him very, very much. And I think every one of us recognise the good deed there. Can I declare an interest as Chair of the Freedom of Religious Belief APPG? I welcome very much the progress that has been reported by the Prime Minister on an essential trade deal. And yet I'd also like to know, if possible, from the Prime Minister, has he had an opportunity to raise the issue of freedom of religious belief with his counterparts in an essential component of any trade deal that must be part of a core value of human rights alongside religious freedom? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know the Foreign Secretary engages on this topic regularly with all our allies where it is relevant, and we will continue to do so because we will stand up for the freedom of expression and religious belief, not just in this country but in countries around the world.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. We now come to the statement from the Home Secretary, but before I call the Home Secretary. Can I remind honourable members that they should not refer to any specific cases currently before the courts, and that they should exercise caution with respect to any specific cases that might subsequently come before the courts in order not to prejudice those proceedings. Statement, Home Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement about the Government's response to the final report of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. The inquiry lasted 7 years and its findings are harrowing. Widespread child sexual abuse going back decades and shameful institutional failures in child protection. Each case represents an intensely personal story of pain and suffering, of a child enduring something that nobody should. I'm so sorry that anyone has. The interests of victims and survivors are at the heart of the inquiry's report and of the Government's response. I want to thank the more than 6,000 victims and survivors who bravely came forward to share their testimonies. I was humbled and moved when meeting with several of them recently. Today is about ensuring that their voices are heard and reflected in our work, so that future generations do not suffer as they did. I promise that their courage will count. I also pay tribute to the chair of the inquiry, Professor Alexis Jay, and her team for their fearless commitment in uncovering horrendous societal, professional, and institutional failures, and for years of meticulous and diligent work. We must use this moment to bring this crime further out of the shadows, provide proper support to all victims and survivors, and deliver real and enduring change. This government has repeatedly shown its determination to stop the scourge of child sexual abuse. Just last month, the Prime Minister and I announced new measures to tackle the evil of grooming gangs. But there is zero room for complacency, and the inquiry's final report confronts us with a necessary moment for further reflection. It is more than a collection of recommendations. It is a call for fundamental change, cultural change, societal change, professional and institutional change. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am pleased to say that this government has risen to the inquiry's challenge. We are accepting the need to act on 19 out of the inquiry's 20 final recommendations. This includes driving work across government to improve the victim's experience of the criminal justice system, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme, workforce regulation, access to records, consistent and compatible data, and communications on the scale and nature of child sexual abuse. The government response does not represent our final word on the inquiry's findings, but rather the start of a new chapter. We will continue to engage with victims and survivors, with child protection organisations and with Professor Jay to ensure they retain visibility into our work and confidence in our delivery. The full government response will be published online at gov.uk. The Welsh Government has also responded separately on these matters relating to Wales alone. I want to now highlight our response to some of the most consequential recommendations, Madam Deputy Speaker. We need to stop perpetrators in their tracks and better protect and support the children they seek to prey upon. To do this, we must address a systemic underreporting of child sexual abuse. As I announced in April, the government accepts the inquiry's recommendation to introduce a new mandatory reporting duty across England. And today, I'm launching the call for evidence, which will inform how this new duty can be best designed to prevent the continued abuse of children and ensure they get help as soon as possible. The inquiry recommended a redress scheme for victims and survivors of historic child sexual abuse, which the government also accepts. Of course, nobody can ever fully compensate victims and survivors for the abuse they suffered. But what we can do is properly acknowledge their suffering, deliver justice and an appropriate form of redress. This is a landmark commitment. It will be complex and it will be challenging, but it really matters. As the inquiry recommends, we will carefully consult victims and survivors. We will draw on lessons from other jurisdictions, and we will make sure that we honour the inquiry's legacy as we design this scheme. Now, we accept there is more we can do to ensure those who have suffered get access to the provision they need to help them recover and rebuild their lives. We have already introduced the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which will ensure the criminal justice system delivers on victims' entitlements. It will also introduce a new statutory duty on local partners to work together when commissioning support services for victims of sexual violence. But where we need to go further, we will. We will elicit views on the future of therapeutic support, including systemic changes to provision, through the extensive consultation we are undertaking on redress. It is right that we consider these things together so that we can better deliver the support needed by child and adult victims and survivors of abuse. The inquiry rightly demands proper leadership and governance of child protection. Since the inquiry's recommendation for a new child protection authority, the Department for Education's implementation strategy, Stable Home Built on Love, has set out major reform to children's social care. Although taking a different form, we are confident that these reforms will fulfil the proposed functions of such a child protection agency and ensure a coherent response across all parts of the system to child sexual abuse. The government will, however, closely monitor the delivery of our commitments through our newly established Child Protection Ministerial Group, inviting scrutiny from victims, survivors and other partners. We will keep this House and the other place regularly updated on our progress. The inquiry makes two recommendations relating to the horrifying and growing threat of online child sexual abuse. The government's law that will make the UK the safest place to be online. The strongest measures in the bill are reserved for child sexual abuse, leaving companies in no doubt about their duties to remove and report child sexual abuse material found on their platforms and use technologies like age verification. Child sexual abuse is a global crime, which is why we continue to lead work with international partners to bring pressure to bear on the big tech companies who must face up to their moral duty to protect children. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no greater evil than hurting a child. This landmark inquiry found that for far too long, stopping child sexual abuse was seen as no one's responsibility. We must ensure that child abuse is brought out of the shadows. We must make it everyone's responsibility. And we must give those who have suffered the confidence that their voices will be heard, their needs will be met, and that they will be protected. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the victims and survivors who came forward, to their families and to their campaigners. Today is their moment, and it must be a watershed moment. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and join her in paying tribute to the victims and survivors of this hideous crime. Many of those victims and survivors have been crucial to establishing the inquiry in the first place and also have been involved working hard to make sure that voices are heard and their strength should be recognised, their calls to action must be heeded. There is no more hideous crime than child sexual exploitation and abuse, a crime that preys on vulnerability and leaves scars that are felt for the rest of a young person's life. And the independent inquiry set up by the Home Secretary's predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, identified failings across a wide range of institutional settings and including local councils, the Anglican and Catholic churches, organised groups and networks, and in each area, action is needed to make sure that that abuse is tackled wherever it is found. Can I welcome the government's acceptance that there needs to be a redress scheme for victims and survivors of historic abuse? And can I ask her the timetable and what the next steps will be on this, as that trauma can last a lifetime and is truly devastating for those who experience it? But can I also say to the Home Secretary, the rest of the statement is inadequate as a government response to such a serious and weighty report. I'm glad she's accepted the need to act on 19 out of 20 recommendations. That is not the same as accepting the recommendations, nor is it the same as setting out what action she's actually going to take. For example, the inquiry said that victims and survivors should receive a guarantee of specialist therapeutic support. All her statement says is we will elicit views on the future of therapeutic support. Well, we know that therapeutic support is inadequate, and we know that there are lots of views already. That was the whole point of the inquiry, to gather those views and that evidence. And on many of the recommendations, there is little detail, and all she has done is simply point to what the government is doing already. I really hope that there is more in the full report that she refers to, but there is far too little to give any confidence in the statement that she has set out today. On mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, Labour called for this near a decade ago. The government finally agreed to do it in April, but all she's done today is open a call for evidence. Well, there have already been lots of calls for evidence. In fact, the inquiry gathered lots of evidence, and at best she could have launched her own call for evidence some time ago. Why isn't the mandatory reporting in the Victims Bill? That is our opportunity to make progress rapidly. And it is far too weak in her response on online child sexual abuse. She's referred to the bill. We know that is long delayed and watered down, but this is not just about the legislation, it's also about the action that is taken. Since then, we've had an inspectorate report on online abuse that described the police response to online child sexual abuse and exploitation as too often leaving vulnerable children at risk, with examples of police taking up to 18 months to make an arrest after becoming aware children were at risk of abuse. There was nothing on that in her statement. What action is she going to take on policing? New evidence too from the Internet Watch Foundation finding that the number of web pages containing Category A material has more than doubled since 2020, just in the last few years alone. And again, the response is wholly inadequate. On charging, we know that the charge rates have got worse and worse. Every year, approximately 500,000 children will be sexually abused. Only 1 in 5 of those are likely to report their abuse. But only 11% of the cases that are reported result in a charge, down from over 30% in 2015. It has got so much worse over the last few years. That means the overwhelming majority of child sexual abusers are facing no consequences. Criminals are getting away with these terrible, terrible crimes. It's even got worse than the last time we discussed this topic in the House in October as well. And on child protection and the barring service, again, we have warned about gaps in the disclosure and barring system. Again, there are still problems there, and only last year we had unaccompanied asylum-seeking children being placed in hotels without properly trained DBS staff. What has she done since then, even to reform child protection in her own department? Children and teenagers have paid the price of the country's failure to tackle child sexual abuse and exploitation. The Home Secretary's predecessor did rightly set up this inquiry, but there is a responsibility on every single one of us, and in particular on the Home Secretary and on the government, to make sure that there is actually action that takes place. This is about the victims and survivors, but it is also about future generations of children whose safety and lives will be at risk if we do not see action.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions and her response and the manner in which she's approached this topic of the utmost seriousness. As I said in my statement, the report represents fundamental change to the way in which we deal with child abuse, and I hope that the recommendations that we are taking forward today demonstrate the government's commitment to tackling this evil. She asks about timetable and pace. On the speed of the report and our response, I hope the Right Honourable Lady will appreciate that it is important that we not only took the time to get the report right, or the independent assessor, Professor Jay, but she will also understand that it is vital that we consider things thoroughly now so that we make the most out of the recommendations and we ensure that we actually deliver the level of reform that will make a meaningful difference on the ground to victims and survivors and will make a difference in culture and prevent this from happening again. This is reform on a level not seen before. It will mark a step change in our approach to child sexual abuse. We need to and we will get it right. And if that takes time, that is time well spent. I do not want to give victims and survivors the false impression that implementing these big commitments will just happen overnight. But what I can promise them is that we are today heralds a new start. It signifies a change in direction and it represents an acknowledgement of what they've been through, what they've testified and the work of this inquiry. The government has accepted the need to act on 19 out of the 20 recommendations. We are accepting the vast majority of these recommendations. I hope that reflects our genuine and real commitment to get this right. I've also committed today to closely monitoring police force data on child sexual abuse, both to ensure that the police are appropriately prioritising this terrible crime, but also to identify where they need other partners like tech companies to improve their own response. Let me be clear. We will do whatever it takes, whatever is necessary to protect children from abuse. No ifs and no buts. Let me issue a few thanks. I want to put on record my thanks to my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, my predecessor, for launching this inquiry, recognising the problem and starting this important work. I want to put on record my thanks to my Right Honourable friend, the Member, the Secretary of State for Education, the Lord Chancellor and other Cabinet Secretaries who've come together to support this government response. This will require a whole-of-government response. It will require a multi-agency response if we are to genuinely protect the interests of children. But above all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank the victims and their families for sharing their stories, for helping us to make this big step forward. I have had the honour of meeting with members of the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel. Today, I met with professionals who are working on the front line, members of the police force, members and employees at the Centre for Expertise for Child Sexual Abuse, hosted at Barnardo's and funded by the Home Office. I visited the Lighthouse Centre in Camden, which provides real therapeutic support to children who've encountered this kind of horrific abuse. And I've worked and met with the NSPCC. I thank all of those professionals on the front line. This is a complex issue. Its enormity cannot be underestimated. I'm enormously grateful to the victims and survivors for their courage. This abuse should never have happened, but I hope that with these changes, we will make a difference and prevent future abuse from taking place. We owe that to past victims and to their families.
Ms Theresa May.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to my Right Honourable friend for her statement today. When I launched set up the panel, independent inquiry, I said that people would be shocked at the level of abuse of children that had taken place in this country. And indeed, the final report showed an appalling and shocking level of abuse, not just historic, but abuse that carries on today. So the government's response is very important. Those who wish to abuse children will look for opportunities to work with children in order to undertake that abuse. Could my Right Honourable friend please say a little more detail about the government's response to the number of recommendations in the report on the disclosure and barring service, the use of barring of disclosure regime for those working with children overseas, and the extending barring of people from working with children who are unsuitable to do so.
Home Secretary.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to point out that we need to enhance the rigour, scrutiny and standards within the workforce when it comes to professionals who have direct contact or responsibilities relating to children. And that's why the recommendations, several of the recommendations relate to registration of care staff in residential care. We accept that recommendation. The registration of staff in young offender institutions and secure training act centres, we accept that, and we are exploring the proposals on how to operate it. We're looking at the recommendations relating to the barred list of people who are unsuitable for work, and the recommendation relating to the duties to inform the disclosure and barring service about individuals who may pose a risk. We are accepting those recommendations as well, and we are exploring the ways and the form in which we can deliver those.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a long history with the ICSA inquiry. I was one of the MPs that first lobbied the then Home Secretary, and I'm incredibly grateful to the Honourable Member for Maidenhead for commissioning this. But that was 7 years ago. That's 7 years of victims and survivors laying their stories out there, telling us that we already knew that this was an epidemic, and there are very practical things the government could have been doing in that time to prevent it. So standing here, hearing the Home Secretary saying she is accepting the need to act, isn't the same as acting. She said victims will have visibility in the work, that there will be consultation, that things will be monitored. Where is the funding? Where is the actual getting on with the recommendations? And what Home Secretary is the one that you're not accepting? You've not told us that.
Well, I've been fully transparent. I've come to the House today to set out our response, and we're also publishing our detailed response to the inquiry, which sets out the detail that she's requested. But in terms of what this government has done, again, I reject the accusation that we have not acted. I'm very proud of the effort that this government has taken so far to get to a point where we are able to accept the vast majority of these recommendations. Now the work starts. We need to ensure that we get those recommendations right and we deliver them in a meaningful way. I'm not apologising for taking the time to get that right. That's why accepting a redress scheme is a landmark commitment that this government is making today. That will ensure that victims of this heinous crime will secure some form of redress. We need to assess what form that is. Not every victim or survivor is the same. We need to ensure how that can be assessed, how it can be delivered to them. There are many, many forms in which redress can take. We need to assess what is appropriate for the victims, listening to survivors, so that we can get that scheme right. I'm determined to do so.
Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Home Secretary's report. In ICSA's final report, they rightly said that the pace of change of technology is of significant concern. And indeed, since that date, I think some 7 months ago, we've seen a seismic shift in AI technology. Now, AI will bring fantastic benefits to society, it already is, but it also brings threats. And I know the Home Secretary is fully aware of this. And those threats are especially acute, I think, for children, such as the already huge amounts of AI-generated child sexual abuse imagery that's being generated and shared by paedophiles. This report was commissioned, as we've heard, by my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, some 8 years ago, and it's taken us that long to reach this point of action. So can I ask my right honourable friend, in the AI age where we can no longer wait and take so much time to act, what processes has she put in place to ensure that her department and laws keep up with this pace of change in technology?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the rapid pace of development in technology as a challenge to grapple with when it comes to protecting children online. And I pay tribute to his work when he was in this place on standing up for child victims and taking a stance against this heinous crime. We are, obviously our online safety bill is making its way through Parliament right now. It is future-proofed to allow the regulator to keep pace with technological developments. But I am working from the Home Office point of view with the National Crime Agency and also GCHQ to identify the new challenges posed by AI. There are opportunities, but there are real risks posed by the proliferation of AI in this field, and we need to ensure that our law enforcement agencies are equipped to deal with it.
Lawrence Eshlomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary stated that the inquiry rightly demands proper leadership and governance of protection of children. An area that demands proper leadership and protection is child criminal exploitation. Yeah. A number of young children who are criminally exploited are sadly sexually exploited as well. A situation where sadly we see a number of girls used by criminal gangs to be multiply gang raped, being asked to perform sexual acts. But these very same girls, when they report this to the police, are viewed as the gang members. They're not treated as victims. Mm-hmm. Does the Home Secretary agree that for us to treat this and treat those girls as victims, we need a proper statutory definition of child criminal exploitation?
Yeah. Well, child sexual exploitation is abhorrent, and this is part of our response to stamping it out. I would just say that since the inquiry published its final report, we've published our Victims and Prisoners Bill. Now that places new duties on local commissioners to commission services to sexual violence, including children, according to need. So when that bill becomes an act, there will be new powers, strengthened opportunities to enable police and crime commissioners to respond to particular needs in their areas, such as the issue she raises.
Alexander Stafford.
Much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for bringing the statement to the House and also for visiting Rother Valley to meet myself and victims of child sexual exploitation only last month. But as well as helping survivors of child rape and their families, like those who were affected in Rotherham and Rother Valley, we must work to ensure that those who failed in their duties of care may no longer hold positions of authority. Does she agree with the points I set out in my recent 10-minute rule bill, Public Offence of Child Sexual Abuse Bill, say that nobody who enabled or facilitated or ignored child sexual abuse should have any position of authority?
Well, I want to thank my honourable friend for his very important campaigning on this issue and his advocacy for victims. And I found it incredibly powerful to visit him in his constituency and meet campaigners and other victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. We are introducing the duty to report. That's one of the key recommendations, and it's one of our key measures that we are taking forward. We want to get it right. We need to balance and ensure that the roles and the responsibilities of those in positions of authority, whether that's in local authorities, whether it's social workers, whether it's teachers or police officers, are able to discharge their duties and ensure that the right balance is struck with protecting children. Professor Jay makes clear that a duty can bring about a culture change. That's what I want to see.
Munira Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I joined the Home Secretary and Shadow Home Secretary in paying tribute to the brave victims who've come forward as part of this inquiry. Young people in care are some of the most vulnerable members of our society, targeted by abusers because they don't have the support networks that other young people grow up with. Now, whilst thousands of foster carers, children's home staff and others do an amazing job providing a stable, loving environment, the report highlighted the shocking abuse that many children in local authority care experience. So will the government be accepting the inquiry's recommendation to amend the Children Act 1989 so that the courts can intervene when local councils aren't exercising their parental responsibilities properly?
We do accept the amendment on the Children Act to give parity of legal protection to children in care, I think is the recommendation to which she's referring. And we accept in spirit the need for parity of that legal protection to children in care. And we are exploring ways in which we can best empower children in care to challenge what is going wrong in their care through the independent review of children's social care and national panel reviews. But importantly, we have the National Safeguarding Review Panel, which takes action and looks in depth into serious incidents, and that can discharge a lot of the functions that have been called for in this inquiry.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome much of what my right honourable friend has said here this afternoon, but she's quite right when she observes that this is a question of cultural behaviour. And the truth is that state institutions have failed these victims for decades, actually based on institutional bias against their social background as much as anything else. And we know that perpetrators are very clever at seeking out their victims and seeking out those who will be least believed. And as she's pointed out, this really requires a whole of government response to really challenge the behaviour of state institutions to actually be more vigilant and take these things seriously. So could I ask her, just to probe a little bit further, how is she going to achieve change in behaviour across the criminal justice system? It's only a matter of weeks since she revealed the Casey review, which again showed some of these behaviours. And also, in respect of the lifetime therapeutic support for victims, it is now 6 years since the NHS England committed to a lifetime care pathway, and yet local commissioners are still not commissioning those necessary services. So what can she say this afternoon to make sure that the government really do deliver on this and this just doesn't sit on the shelf?
I'm very cognizant of that risk, and the one thing I want is I want to be held to account for my words today, and I want another update to this House on progress, on delivery of our response in due course. In terms of how to bring about a culture change, the report is very clear. I mean, I believe that mandatory reporting, a duty, a legal obligation, will direct and force professionals' minds into a particular way of thinking. And that will be accompanied by training, it must be accompanied by peer support, but that is how we will bring about a culture change so that we avoid and eliminate this kind of turning a blind eye to apparent problems which are of a heinous nature. In terms of support, what the government's done already, I mean, there's been significant increases in government funding for victims of sexual violence, including child sexual abuse. The Home Office's support for victims and survivors of child sexual abuse has got funding of over £4.5 million, and we've distributed that to charities who provide vital support. The NHS long-term plan commits an additional £2.3 billion for the expansion and transformation of mental health services. So that needs to now we need to ensure that gets down to the grassroots level and reaches the victims and the survivors. But there is a lot of work that's already gone on within government.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, it's estimated that just 1 in 5 of child victims report to the police. But in my experience in local government, when we had young people that were disclosing that they were being abused, was that they needed an independent advocate and an independent voice to go to so that they would be listened to and treated with sympathy. And it's not necessarily reporting to the police that's required. So what can the Home Secretary say about what she's doing to open up those avenues so that people can report with confidence that they will be listened to?
Well, it's precisely the issue that he raises, and that's the reason why I'm a passionate supporter of independent sexual violence advisors, ISVAs, also for IDVAs, but they are also relevant for children who are victims of sexual violence. And we already have a lot of, we've increased the number of ISVAs available to victims of sexual violence, including children, so that when someone makes a complaint and they enter the criminal justice system, they will have an independent professional who is on their side to help them navigate a very traumatic and daunting process, who can provide clarity and can provide that vital support that can make the difference between a successful prosecution and an unsuccessful one.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have previously declared an interest because I was counsel to the inquiry from 2016 to 17. Given that the inquiry looked at cases that were often decades old, there is a risk that we see its conclusions as belonging to the past rather than the present. But one of the recommendations of the inquiry is creating a protective environment for children. And although that will have meant something different in some of the contexts that we looked at, we know now from the Children's Commissioner that one of the biggest drivers of child sexual exploitation is the ubiquity of violent online porn, particularly when the perpetrator is also a child. Can I ask the Home Secretary, therefore, what reassurances she can give that the online safety bill really will protect children from viewing this kind of content? And could I ask her, rather more boldly, whether she would consider working with her counterparts at DCMS to regulate the content of some of the big porn providers like Pornhub, which we know, through a body of evidence, hosts and promotes child sexual exploitation in some of its online content?
Well, my honourable friend speaks with expertise, but she raises a very important point with which I agree. The ubiquity, as she puts it, of online pornography and its accessibility by children is a major factor in the incidence of criminal behaviour of this type. The online safety bill will mark a game changer in the protection of children online, and it will take us forward in preventing children from accessing this heinous material. Through the bill, companies will need to take a robust approach to protect children from illegal content, and there will be and criminal behaviour on their services. And they'll also need to assess whether their service is likely to be accessed by children, and if so, deliver safety measures for them. Those safety measures will need to protect children, and there will be measures relating to age verification. In my mind, that represents a robust step change in how we protect children online.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As co-chair for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Safeguarding in Faith Communities, can I thank the Minister for Safeguarding for her letter to our group written on the 12th of May. We appreciate that there are many recommendations in the inquiry's final report and that there needs to be careful consideration of them. But given the years of historical abuse and the years of inquiry, can I urge the Home Secretary to do all she can to ensure these wrongs are righted and we see action, not more consultation, for the victims and survivors, and as quickly as possible?
Well, I want to move as quickly as possible as well, and I want to get it right. For example, the redress scheme. We have the starting point of Professor Jay's recommendation, and that is a very helpful starting point. We've now accepted that recommendation. There are various models around the world of how a redress scheme can operate. Australia, Scotland, more localised examples. We need to ensure that the right criteria are established, that the process is robust and fair, and that ultimately the victims and survivors get the redress, the justice and the closure that they seek.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome today's statement, and can I put on record my thanks to all of those who helped influence this report, particularly the victims of child sexual exploitation, as well as my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, for instigating this report. Unfortunately, child sexual exploitation is something which haunts my community in Keighley, and I have held many a round table with victims and their families who have had to go through the incredibly traumatic experiences, and I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Whittam, when she was Home Secretary, for coming up and listening to some of those terrible stories. And one of the things that definitely came across was this issue of trust. Lack of trust, and trust disappearing in the very organisations that should be there to protect the most vulnerable in society, whether that is the police, our local authorities, or indeed the healthcare systems. And that was further illustrated by a report by the Bradford Safeguarding Partnership in July of 2021, 2021, which only looked at 5 children across the Bradford district that had experienced child sexual exploitation, which is why I want to see a full Rotherham-style inquiry into child sexual exploitation across the Bradford district, so we can get to grips with some of the complexities at a local level across the Bradford district. So will the Home Secretary give a commitment to work with all government departments on this issue, as it needs to be a whole government approach, not only with the Department for Education, but the Department for Health and indeed the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Local Government, because it is only when we're all working with these departments and at a local level with local authorities and devolved mayoralties that we can get to grips and tackle this issue once and for all.
Well, my honourable friend speaks very powerfully, and I pay tribute to all of his campaigning on behalf of his constituents on this very serious issue. The reports relating to Rochdale and Telford and Rotherham are all very powerful in their conclusions, and they speak to a very similar situation to which he refers. That, you know, these professionals not taking action, that's what the mandatory duty seeks to address by placing a legal obligation on professionals to identify signs and indicators of child sexual abuse, providing them with the right training so that they have the know-how to deal with these very delicate but devastating matters, will be a game changer. Professionals on the front line will have at the forefront of their professional training what child sexual abuse looks like, how to identify it, and what action to take to stop it.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The recent appalling court case into the murder of Finlay Bowden, which led to the conviction of murder by his parents, exposed very serious questions about the social work practice at Derbyshire Social Services and indeed the actions taken by the court. And for that reason, this recommendation of the creation of a new Child Protection Authority was very much welcomed. Can the Home Secretary tell us what specifically the proposed functions of a child protection agency that she now believes will be better delivered by the Department for Education's implementation strategy are, and why she believes that approach is better than the creation of the Child Protection Authority that was recommended in this report?
May I put on record my sympathies and to the family of the honourable gentleman's constituents. When it comes to the Child Protection Authority, we absolutely agree that we need a sharper focus on improving practice in child protection and ensuring that we're all playing our part to keep children safe. And since the inquiry report of the Department for Education is in responding to the care review, has set out a bold vision for reform of social care and child protections, stable homes built on love. And the government is confident that those reforms will deliver the intention behind the inquiry's recommendation for a new Child Protection Authority.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I put on record my tribute to my constituents who gave evidence to the ICSA inquiry? They relived their trauma so that changes can be made in the future, and they are amongst the most courageous people I know. One of the recommendations from ICSA's final report is for the introduction of arrangements for the registration of staff working in care roles in children's homes, including secure children's homes. This is an obvious practical recommendation which would make a material difference to the safety of children living in local authority care. But it was originally recommended in 2018, and there was really no excuse for the government not to act at that time to implement it. Since that time, children have continued to suffer abuse and neglect in children's homes, including those run by the Hesley Group in Doncaster and the Calcott Homes in Oxfordshire. Can I ask the Home Secretary why she waited 5 years to act, and can she update the House on the timescale for implementing this very important recommendation?
Well, we accept the kind of meaning and the significance of recommendation 7, to which she refers, registration of staff working in care roles in children's homes. We are exploring the proposals to introduce professional registration of the residential childcare workforce as part of the Stable Homes Built on Love strategy, key and landmark reforms to our care system. But we recognise the important contribution of the residential childcare workforce in caring for some of the most vulnerable children in our society, and the importance of ensuring that they have the skills required to safeguard, support and care for those children. We're backing them with investment and reform.
I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. Point of order, Crispin Blunt.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Thursday, there was a debate on psilocybin access rights, a technical and detailed area of policy, changes to which are hoped to transform the effectiveness of current mental health treatment. How can backbenchers successfully use the procedures of this House to enable debate, to hold the government to account for proposed policy changes they will not make if the responsible minister will not reply to the debates, particularly when the debates are led by colleagues who have long made personal study of that particular area of policy, such as the Honourable Member for Inverclyde and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, but not least when they are then reinforced by the harrowing personal experience of honourable members of this House, such as the Honourable Lady for Warrington North.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving me notice of his point of order. I believe that as the Minister is here, I believe that he would like to, so I suggest that we ask the Minister to make a brief response.
Just very briefly, I regret that I wasn't in Parliament at the time of the debate. I did give my honourable friend advance notice of that. I was at the Defence establishment in Porton Down at the time. As often happens, another Home Office Minister, a very capable Home Office Minister, replied. I have previously met one-to-one with the member for Warrington North to discuss this in detail and replied to an adjournment debate just a few weeks ago. As I said at the time, I have, subsequent to those two, the debate and the meeting, asked the ACMD to accelerate their work on removing barriers to research for all Schedule 1 drugs, including psilocybin, so I can take this opportunity to assure my honourable friend that work, I have asked for it to be accelerated, and the calls that he and other members have made have been heard.
I'm sorry. Further to that point of order, I mean, I do feel the Minister has been given quite a long response, but...
Well, I regret to say, Madam Speaker, there was an inaccuracy in my right honourable friend's response. When I alerted him to the date of the second debate on psilocybin access rights on the 18th of May, he did tell me that he had an engagement that day. However, it never occurred to me for a moment that he would put that engagement ahead of his duty replying to this House. And I certainly got no communication at all that he had made a decision not to attend a Parliament to reply to that debate.
Well, I hope the honourable gentleman will accept that it's not really my responsibility to decide which ministers respond to debates, but I do think it is courteous that the Minister has come here today and has given an explanation, and I suggest if the honourable gentleman isn't satisfied with that response, I'm sure he will pursue it with the Minister. Perhaps a meeting might be arranged, but I don't really want to prolong this too much further because I think we're just in danger of going backwards and forwards over the same issue, and the honourable gentleman is clearly not happy that the Minister here wasn't there for the debate, but the Minister has explained his reasons. The honourable gentleman may not be happy with those reasons, but there is not a great deal I can do about that. But I do think that his point has been heard, and I suggest that I believe we have to move on to another point of order. Owen Thompson.
Deputy Speaker, thank you. Earlier this afternoon at Home Office Questions, the Immigration Minister, who I have notified of this point of order, appeared to suggest that it was somehow my responsibility that there had been no asylum seekers through the dispersal scheme housed in Midlothian. Now, Midlothian's a very warm and welcoming community, and indeed we are looking forward to welcoming anyone from anywhere at any time. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reason for my point of order is that despite the Minister suggesting that there had been no attempts to have any asylum seekers through the dispersal scheme housed in Midlothian, I was notified on the 22nd of February of the Home Office's intention to house asylum seekers in my Midlothian constituency. But then again, on the 1st of March, the Home Office notified me that they no longer intended to proceed with that dispersal. Now, perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's maybe not for me to say, but if the Home Office were to engage with local authorities or local councils or the Scottish Government, these sort of issues could be dealt with. But I'd ask you for your advice as to how I can best ensure that the record is correct, to ensure that there is no slur on the Midlothian constituency as any way suggesting it's not welcoming of anyone from any background coming to it, and how the record can be corrected to reflect that.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that point of order. He doesn't have to notify ministers that he intends to raise a point of order, but I don't know whether he did or not. Okay. Well, he has made his view very clear about what the minister said. I know that there are honourable members present, PPSs, who it feels to me that they are going to report back what he has said very quickly, as I'm sure that the whips will. He's put his point of view on the record, and I'm sure that if any necessary corrections need to be made, the Minister would do so, or he may communicate directly with the honourable gentleman. Thank you. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Non-Domestic Rating Bill Committee.
Now, order. Order.
Non-Domestic Rating Bill.
Before I call the mover of Amendment 4, I just want to remind the committee that while I'm in the chair, I can be addressed as Madam Chair or Dame Rosie, but not as Madam Deputy Speaker. We always have to remind colleagues of this before we move into committee. We begin with Amendment 4 to Clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider all other amendments, clauses stand part, new clauses and schedule stand part. Peter Alders to move Amendment 4.
Thank you very much, Dame Rosie. I move Amendment 4, which it will be convenient to discuss the clauses and schedules stand part with all the selected amendments and new clauses. Dame Rosie, I shall start off where I left off in the second reading debate on this bill. By way of background, this bill is to be welcomed, though it is important that it is viewed as the start of the process of fundamentally reforming business rates and not the end game. It probably would have been preferable to have heeded the advice of the Chartered Institute of Taxation and for the government to have brought forward a new Consolidated Business Rates Act rather than to amend the Local Government Finance Act of 1988. This, Dame Rosie, would have sent out the message to businesses, both large and small, that real change is on the way. However, we are where we are, and we must ensure that ultimately this bill paves the way for reducing business rates to an affordable level, to putting the business rate system on a long-term, more easily understood footing, and removes those barriers to regional growth. We must have in mind the ultimate end goal, which should be to get the uniform business rate multiplier back down from an excess of 50p in the pound to the more affordable 30p in the pound, which is where we started when this system came in the early 90s. To get to this, we need annual valuations, we need the abolition of the multitude of complicated reliefs, and we need to digitalise the Valuation Office Agency. This bill, Dame Rosie, does move us in this direction, perhaps a little too tentatively. Moreover, the duty to notify, which takes up a lot of this bill, does add an added bureaucratic burden on businesses, and there are some unintended consequences which we should avoid, and there is a need to have in mind the need at all times for increased transparency. The amendments, Dame Rosie, which I have tabled, have these considerations in mind. Any adjustments to the business rate system should be guided by two principles: reducing the regulatory burden on businesses and, as I've already said, reducing that uniform business rate multiplier. Dame Rosie, we should look at this bill with these considerations in mind and aim to move towards a sustainable system which provides a long-term revenue stream which businesses can find bearable, which has not been the case for so often in recent years. Dame Rosie, a properly functioning property tax system is critical to achieving a vibrant and sustainable economy. For most of this century, an outdated and unresponsive business rate system has placed enormous strain on many businesses, particularly those in the retail and hospitality sectors. And this strain, moreover, has not been shared equally across the country. And this illustrates how the current system is a hindrance, a logjam to levelling up. We need non-domestic rates to be more responsive to changes in the economy so as to ensure that the system does not place an undue and unfair strain on businesses. If we can achieve this, we shall be more able to attract long-term investment into our towns and cities, and we shall be better placed to meet other vital policy objectives, such as revitalising our high streets and achieving our net zero aims and goals. Dame Rosie, clause 5 of the bill relates to the frequency at which revaluations take place. And as I have mentioned, we need to move to that end goal of having annual valuations. This way, business rates will be more in line with the economic outlook. Amendments 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 in my name are tabled with this objective in mind. In order to achieve a responsive business rate system, valuations should be carried out as regularly as possible. The bill makes a good first step by increasing valuations from every 5 years to every 3 years, but there should be flexibility to allow a future government to have more frequent valuations, ultimately every year. Annual revaluations would bring bills more in line with actual commercial property values rather than lagging many years behind. Even with a 3-year list and a 2-year antecedent valuation date, occupiers will find themselves in early 2026 paying business rates bills based on valuations from nearly 5 years beforehand. Annual revaluations are essential if the government is serious about modernising the business rate system. They take place in places as diverse as Hong Kong and the Netherlands, and thus there is no reason why they should not take place in England and Wales. Dame Rosie, I would conclude this section by commenting that the enormous administrative burden placed on ratepayers by the new duty to notify measures would certainly not be worth the distress and inconvenience it will cause if it does not result in the ultimate introduction of annual revaluations. It is in this context that I would urge the government to give full consideration to these amendments. Dame Rosie, clause 13 sets out the requirement for ratepayers to provide the information. This is the new duty to notify, which, as drafted, places an unnecessary burden on businesses. Amendments 13, 14 and 15 have the objective of reducing this burden and introducing penalties on the Valuation Office Agency. Amendments 18 and 19 relate to clause 19 and ensure that guidance is made available to business ratepayers before the duty to notify comes into effect. The new duty to notify will place an onus on all ratepayers to provide the Valuation Office Agency with any information that they reasonably believe could impact on the business rates valuation. This, Dame Rosie, is an enormous additional ask, not least for those 700,000 businesses who up to now have not been subject to business rates and may be completely unaware of what is proposed. The duty requires the ratepayers to notify the VOA of changes to their properties within a 60-day window, with the risk of financial sanctions and even imprisonment if they fail to comply. Dame Rosie, myself as a former chartered surveyor, I cannot see how such a burdensome duty on all commercial property occupiers, including, as I have said, current non-ratepayers, can be justified as necessary to administer a move to free yearly revaluations. This duty might be bearable for businesses if it assisted the VOA with its administration of a move to annual revaluations. For small businesses, it is going to cause more pain than the gain that will be derived from moving to free yearly valuations. The new duty will leave many ratepayers wondering as to what might qualify as a notifiable change. The VOA is yet to publish any guidance, and thus many businesses will take no chances and will notify the VOA of any changes to their properties. The VOA will hence be hoisted on their own petard, as they will be flooded with paperwork. Dame Rosie, as I mentioned in the second reading debate, many businesses, particularly SMEs without any rating expertise, will turn to rogue rating advisors for help. Business rate advisors do not require a licence to practice, and many unscrupulous operators will see the new duty to notify as an opportunity to take advantage of small businesses. Dame Rosie, whilst the ratepayer has a short period in which to notify the VOA of any changes to the property, as the bill stands, the VOA has no such obligation. They can, in effect, respond to notifications at their leisure. I'm therefore proposing a reciprocal provision that places on the VOA a 60-day time frame in which to respond to notifications with rebates to the ratepayer equivalent to the fines set out in clause 13 accompanying a failure to comply. Dame Rosie, clause 6 is a short and simple, but nevertheless extremely important clause, in that it gives effect to the removal of downwards transitional phasing, as was announced by my Right Honourable friend the Chancellor on 17th November of last year in his autumn statement. This, Dame Rosie, was a positive step. But clause 6, as drafted, does not permanently remove the threat of downwards phasing, which is a punitive tax that unfairly penalises occupiers whose rateable values have fallen. It is wrong to force those whose property values have fallen to subsidise those whose property values have risen. The clause as it stands simply removes the requirement for a transitional phasing mechanism to be revenue neutral. This means that the government no longer needs to fund any upwards transitional mechanism with a corresponding downwards transitional mechanism. However, what this means is that a downwards mechanism can be easily introduced by a future government without any parliamentary scrutiny. Amendments 11 and 12 plug this loophole and permanently abolish downwards transitional phasing. If any future government wants to reintroduce it, they should come to Parliament and make the case for it, rather than bringing it in through the back door. Dame Rosie, Amendment 16 deletes clause 14, which from my perspective is inequitable and unfair to businesses. As it stands, Clause 14 exempts government legislation as qualifying for the pursuit of a material change of circumstances. This would remove a vital check on government and would allow future governments to legislate with impunity at the expense of businesses right across the country who will have no recourse to challenge legislation that interferes with their ability to do business. A material change in circumstances gives ratepayers recourse to pursue relief on their business rates when circumstances outside of their control hinder their ability to do business. What Clause 14 does is to exempt government legislation from being a qualifying reason for a material change in circumstances. I would anticipate that the reason why the government have included this clause is that they want business rates to be a predictable source of revenue, even if its own legislation or action undermines the rateable value of the properties occupied by businesses. During the COVID lockdown, Dame Rosie, so as to prevent the spread of the virus, the government forced a number of businesses to cease trading. However, instead of accepting that there had been a material change of circumstances for those occupiers and allowing appeals to be lodged, the government introduced a locally administered compensation scheme. Now, with Clause 14, the government is seeking the freedom to introduce any legislation at any time that might alter the rateable value of a property. Dame Rosie, this is both unprecedented and wrong. Clause 14, I would suggest, can be viewed as a power grab that sets a dangerous precedent and tells occupiers that they will have to accept the detrimental impact of legislation on their ability to do business with no legal recourse available. Amendment 16 deletes Clause 14, restoring the ability of ratepayers to claim a material change in circumstances, regardless of how the change in circumstances arose. Dame Rosie, Amendments 4, 5, 17 and 25 amend and add to clauses 1 and 14 and Part 1 of the schedule. They address an issue, a niche issue, actually, albeit an extremely important one. The out-of-home advertising industry, which includes adverts on billboards, walls, digital posters, street furniture, bus shelters, buses themselves and railway stations, those that we see as we all go around our lives every day and probably take for granted, these are an important form of income for local authorities, and it is estimated that almost half of the revenue generated goes back into local communities. These amendments abolish the liability to non-domestic rating in respect of advertising rights. The removal of business rates on advertising rights from the rating list would have three advantages. Firstly, it would increase the value and level of services provided by local authorities. Secondly, it would remove a competitive disadvantage to growth which impacts the out-of-home advertising industry, which does not apply to its rival broadcast, print or online media. And thirdly, it would reduce the high level of inefficiencies relating to advertising rights through the VOA, local authorities and the out-of-home advertising industry. The bill as currently drafted will directly and adversely impact on the industry's ability to invest in local communities, and it runs contrary to the bill's objective of reducing barriers to business investment. In 2023, Dame Rosie, business rates charged on advertising rights are an antiquated, out-of-date and ineffective tax. Advertising rights are the only remaining right attracting liability to non-domestic rating. The liability to non-domestic rating in respect of sporting rights was abolished by the 1997 Local Government Rating Act. Amendments, as I've said, 4, 5, 17 and 28 remove this anomaly. In conclusion, Dame Rosie, I do have enormous respect for the Minister and also for his co-sponsor of the bill, my right honourable friend, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury. And whilst the Treasury aren't on the front bench at the current time, I'm just mindful that this bill has been drafted very much from a Treasury perspective, gathering in all that money, which is incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But can I suggest we also need to look at this through the prism of business? And what business needs, whether that is large, medium, small, what they need is confidence and uncertainty. And they also need a fully reformed business rates system that takes on board, I would suggest, some of the amendments that I've put forward. And what this will do, if we have that fully reformed system, what it will do, businesses will know where they stand. They will know that, they'll know the business rates themselves will not be that great, the sort of elephant in the room for businesses at the moment. And what they will be able to do, they will be able to invest, to build on their businesses, to expand their best businesses with a degree of confidence. What that will do will lead to increased profits. And what that will do, joy to the Treasury, is increased taxation. And so what I would say, now the bill does make a start on this. What we can do, and what we should do, is actually, this bill provides the opportunity to turn what is the vicious circle of business rates into a virtuous circle. Thank you very much indeed, David.
The question is that Amendment 4 be made. Shadow Minister Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've stated in previous stages, we are overall supportive of the measures in this bill because it's crucial local authorities and businesses have clarity as soon as possible so they can prepare for what's to come. And we've worked constructively to try and improve the legislation before it gets to them. However, this bill is still lacking in areas that small businesses are crying out for help with. In the second reading in this House, I raised the pressure small businesses, particularly small chains such as convenience stores, will be under due to the intensified reporting requirements. While it is certainly important to increase accountability for businesses submitting their finances, stakeholder groups such as the Association for Convenience Stores and the Shopkeepers Campaign have drawn attention to the stifling impact the new requirements could have on their businesses. Some SMEs may resort to outsourcing their account reporting, risking another financial hit in return. We are yet to see the government address these concerns or consider any alternatives. There is still not enough detail in the bill on how new reliefs will be implemented by local authorities and how they will be compensated for income foregone. The bill is also missing a crucial assessment of any new burdens that might arise administratively for councils and how they will be supported in handling them. Need I remind the House that local governments are already operating on skeletal budgets, trying to do the utmost for their residents while declining resources. Since 2010, core funding for councils has reduced by £16 billion. Needs have only risen as we've endured austerity followed by a catastrophic mini-budget. The funds announced by the Chancellor in the spring budget don't touch the surface of the challenge that councils currently face. Yet it's, of course, welcome that the government have committed to consult local authorities and other stakeholders in how to address business rates, avoidance and evasion. Because when we are asking local authorities to put enhanced resources into new reliefs, we must also ensure they are getting their fair dues back from the businesses. The government could go further in this regard by tightening up the rules around empty property and charitable reliefs. The Welsh Labour government may be a good example for the Minister to perhaps look into. Further thought should also be given to allowing councils the ability to set their own business multiplier, which is tailored to their local economies and the needs of their businesses. And we cannot ignore the fact we desperately need reforms in the way we tax online businesses in this country. This is woefully missing in the strategy from this government so far. When will we see a serious review of taxing digital giants? The government is failing. It's failing in its responsibility to tax fairly. And while businesses boom for major online corporations, our bricks and mortar businesses continue to struggle through. Another failure from those on the benches opposite is the complete refusal to raise the threshold of small business rates relief. Our proposal, Labour's proposal, to raise the threshold to £25,000 would have saved our high streets more than £1 billion. And if ministers won't listen to me, then please listen to the Federation of Small Businesses, because this is also a measure that they back. And they say it would lift over 200,000 small businesses out of business rates altogether. And why did the Minister and his colleagues decide that this wasn't money worth saving? Perhaps it's because they're the ones not footing the bill. Now, Chair, I'll come to the amendments. Colleagues have tabled some reasonable amendments to the bill that would see some burdens lifted for small and medium-sized enterprises particularly, as well as enhancing transparency in local authority processes. However, further thought is needed on the unintended consequences of these alterations. The Honourable Member for Waveney has put forward a range of amendments. Regarding his fourth amendment, the Local Government Association rightly points out that a consequence of abolishing liability to non-domestic rates of advertising would actually be a reduction in income for local authorities. In a time when councils are more stretched than ever, we cannot consider seriously adding more financial constraints to this already flawed bill. New Clause 1, tabled in the name of the Honourable Member from North Shropshire, is one such amendment which is attempting to be constructive, but could actually create difficulties for local authorities further down the line. On these benches, we have always been in favour of stronger transparency, so we support the idea, in principle, of more frequent updating and local non-domestic rating lists. However, this amendment prompts a question over resourcing. If the government opts to require annual reporting from the VOA according to the targets they will set, they will need to outline how they will support local authorities. Because, again, this is an added burden on staff time which has not been accounted for. I don't need to remind the Minister that the decline in funds over the past 13 years has led to staff being overstretched, with vacancies high and workloads even higher. Colleagues must agree that adding more pressure onto a diminishing workforce without extra resources is only going to reduce the quality of services. Amendment 20, also tabled in the name of the Honourable Member for North Shropshire, is a more straightforward suggestion that would ease burdens for small businesses, relinquishing them of the need to report to the VOA in years when there is no change in their business. It would free up valuable resources in these hard-pressed companies and would also free up time for VOA staff to focus their attention on assessing businesses who have actually had circumstantial changes. We are supportive of this common-sense measure. It would be a welcome change to this bill and a welcome change from ministers if they were willing to take on this constructive suggestion. However, ultimately, Madam Chair, what we are attempting to do with this bill is make minor improvements on a problematic and outdated business rates policy that, if we are fortunate enough to be in government, Labour would abolish anyway. These discussions may all prove futile if the British people entrust the Labour Party to bring in the change that we so desperately need. Labour in power would scrap the dysfunctional system of business rates entirely. No longer will high street businesses be forced to close the shutters due to soaring rents and rates. Online giants will finally pay their dues, paying British taxes for the trading that they do in our country. Small and medium-sized enterprises will be supported from being start-ups to successful national businesses, and all alongside our promise to abolish the shameful non-domiciled tax status that too many of the super wealthy in this country exploit. And by raising the digital services tax paid by the likes of Amazon, we'll be able to raise the threshold of small business rates relief, helping more homegrown SMEs thrive in our retail sector. Labour is the party of business. We have a plan to make it fairer, easier and safer to trade in our country after 13 years of crushing economic failure. We will create new green jobs, boosting Britain's income and therefore our accountability to support local businesses. And a huge part of that is finally addressing the problem that this bill only skirts around. The current business rate system hinders entrepreneurs and is starving our once thriving high streets of viable businesses
And over the last 13 years, what we have seen is managed decline from village to town to city. And it will take clear thinking and bold action to stop that. Sadly, both are missing from this timid bill.
Helen Morgan.
Oh, thank you, Dame Rosie. I rise to speak to Amendments 1, 2, 3 and 20, as well as new clauses 1 and 2 tabled in my name. And I note the excellent speech by the Honourable Member of Waveney, who tabled amendments with very similar objectives to my own. This bill is a disappointment to all businesses who are struggling through tough financial conditions. Not only are prices going up for every single purchase they make, but many small businesses were forced to lock into gas and electricity contracts at astronomical rates last year and are no longer receiving any meaningful support with those energy costs. And they may also be struggling with interest rate rises on their borrowings following the period of economic chaos caused by the government last autumn. Now, this government committed to reviewing the system of business rates fundamentally in their 29 manifesto, but all this bill offers are peripheral changes to an outdated system that doesn't work for a modern economy. The bill offers change to the timescale of revaluations from every 5 years to every 3 years. Now, this is a welcome reduction, but Liberal Democrats believe it doesn't go far enough. The reality for businesses is that a 3-year gap between revaluations means that they will continue to pay rates which are far from reflective of the real economic conditions they're operating in. Amendments 1, 2 and 3 would require non-domestic rating lists to be compiled every year and make every year from now on a relevant period for transitional provision under the 1988 Act. Annual revaluations are possible. We only need to look to the Netherlands, where they've been taking place since 1995 and have allowed rateable values to move with the local economy. This means the tax that businesses are required to pay better reflects the conditions that they face. I also want to spend a little time on Amendment 20 tabled in my name. As it stands, it's estimated that as a result of this bill, 700,000 small businesses who currently don't pay business rates at all will need to submit annual reports to the Valuation Office Agency, even where there's been no change to the premises they occupy. These small businesses, like many in North Shropshire, are already plagued by seemingly endless monthly and quarterly ONS returns, along with their ongoing tax and financial reporting requirements. The bill adds yet another administrative hoop for these businesses to jump through, and it threatens hefty penalties if forms are completed incorrectly. This piles on unnecessary pressure to small businesses, and it won't raise any more tax for public services. These businesses already receive a notification to inform the Valuation Office Agency if there's a material change in their premises, so there's nothing to be gained from this particular element of the bill. Amendment 20 attempts to deal with this problem by removing the requirement for annual reporting of no change for those businesses in receipt of small business rate relief. I urge the Minister to support Amendment 20, which I do intend to push to a vote today, and cut unnecessary red tape for the small businesses we desperately need to help to drive economic growth and breathe new life into the high streets of our historic market towns. I also wish to speak to new clause 1 tabled in my name, Dame Rosie. It seems very one-sided to impose punitive fees on businesses for failing to report updates on time to the Valuation Office Agency without any reciprocal expectations of that agency. As I outlined in the second reading debate, dealing with the Valuation Office Agency over changes to a premises can be a very protracted affair, and all the time this is going on, businesses face uncertainty about their rates liability and they can't critically plan their cash flow. New Clause 1 would require the Valuation Office Agency to report to the Secretary of State on its performance in detail at least once a year. This report would correspond to targets to be set by the Secretary of State, and it would call for the findings of these reports to be laid before Parliament. Now, I've suggested targets rather than legally binding levels of service, reflecting the fact that no two premises are the same, that updates can be complex and can be challenged, but they would at least set an expectation of performance and ensure some accountability for the Valuation Office Agency. Lastly, Dame Rosie, I wish to draw attention to new clause 2. I think there's general agreement on all sides of the House that we want to see high streets and market towns thrive. And this is especially true in places such as the 5 historic towns in my North Shropshire constituency, where the local high street is not just a practical place to go to, but a social lifeline for many residents. And it's these high street shops which are in competition with online retailers whose warehouse premises have a much lower rateable value per metre squared, putting the high street at a disadvantage. Now, this was confirmed in the Treasury Select Committee report in 2019 on the impact of business rates on business. Disappointingly, however, the bill doesn't take this discrepancy into consideration. Instead, it would continue to drain physical retailers with rates that don't reflect the challenges they are already facing, leaving many at tipping point and struggling to compete in what is an unfair playing field. Clause 2 requires a review of the impact of non-domestic rateable values on competition in different parts of the retail sector so that members can understand the true scale of the issue and inform future policy accordingly. This review should be commissioned within 6 months after the date of the Act is passed. So overall, I urge the Ministers to support the new amendments and clauses to improve this bill, which is just not ambitious enough in fundamentally reforming an out-of-date tax system. Thank you.
Minister Lee Rowling.
Thank you, Dame Rosie, and I'm grateful to all colleagues across the House for their contributions today. Many of us were, I think all of us spoke at the second reading on the non-domestic ratings bill, and we have rehearsed the arguments on a number of these points already before, but it's important from the government bench that we reiterate that this bill delivers significant reforms of the business rate system. It increases the frequency of revaluations, which I think has been generally welcomed across the benches today. It modernises the administration of the tax, and it does provide new reliefs to support things like property improvements. And taken along with the nearly £14 billion worth of taxpayer subsidy for businesses this year, it helps to manage the tax burden amid the ongoing pressures which the Honourable Lady from Shropshire North talked about a moment ago. I will now turn to the contributions from honourable members and honourable friends made today, speaking first to my honourable friend from Waveney, who made an incredibly constructive set of comments, and I completely understand the sentiments behind many of the amendments which he has put forward, and he set a challenge at the outset of his speech, saying that he was looking for annual valuations or moving towards annual valuations, the removal of complications and digitisation. And I hope that making some progress against 2 out of 3 of those isn't bad. And the honourable gentleman, the honourable friend from Waveney, has indicated overall that this is a step in the right direction. We are moving from annual valuations of 5 years, which have in reality been every 7 or 8 years in a number of instances over recent times for good reasons, to 3 years. We are moving towards the collection of further data from a digital basis, and we are continuing to support businesses where we can through the reliefs which we've put in place. Turning to my honourable friend's points around greater frequencies of evaluation specifically, I absolutely acknowledge the desire of honourable friends and members across the House to move to a more frequent valuation. I hope the government's move from 5 to 3 years is a positive step in the right direction, and we have said we will look at this again in the coming years where we are able to do so. But that change, which has been referenced in all of the speeches today, does come with the necessity to change how we are approaching business rates in general. And unless we are to make the extremely significant, large amounts of upheaval that would be required in terms of fundamental changes to the system, which we are not supportive of, then we do have to look as a country about how we change the collection of the data and how we change these processes so they are more effective. We currently have a process of check, challenge and appeal where necessary. The changes which we're bringing in, including through the collection of some of this additional data, which has been referenced by honourable members, removes or helps to reduce and remove at least one part of those processes, the check process. And if we are going to move to more annual valuations, we have to acknowledge that more data will need to be provided one way or another, because simply doing 2 million checks through the current process would not work if we are moving to a greater frequency. My honourable friend from Waveney also talks in his amendments 13, 14 and the like around the 100% relief and ratepayers and how they must still comply with duties. And whilst I do understand the concerns which he has outlined, information collected on specific properties is often used in the valuation of other comparable properties, many of which may not receive 100% relief. A small business which occupies a single shop might pay no rates, whereas the same property, if in use by another business, such as the co-op or whatever, may be liable for rates as a result. So we have to have in mind the whole and broad-based gamut of business rates when we're considering the collection of data and then the utility of that data. My honourable friend also talks and has spoken at second reading with regards to his concerns around a material change in circumstances, and whilst I understand my honourable friend's concerns, I hope if I can reiterate again from the dispatch box the recognition on the part of the government that these changes are being brought in, subject to the will of the House, in order to reflect and respond to the kind of extraordinary events which we saw a number of years ago through COVID. Whilst we hope it will never happen again, we are seeking to ensure that the powers are there in those extreme circumstances where they may be necessary, even though we wish those circumstances will never occur again in our lifetime. Turning to the opposition bench, my honourable lady from Luton North, I almost called my honourable lady my honourable friend, which of course she is in everywhere other than this chamber. I'm grateful again for the opposition's front bench's overall support for this bill. We will have differences in terms of its implementation, which she has cogently outlined, but I am grateful for the constructive approach which she has provided to the bill to date. And I would just gently remind on the point specifically about online sales and reforms around that, that the revaluation which has been brought in recent months has seen around a 20% reduction in the average costs for retail and a 27% increase in the average cost for online distribution warehouses. So when she asked the question, when will they be reformed, there is already reform underway. And then finally, just turning to the honourable lady from North Shropshire, who made a number of points which I hope have covered, but I want to turn finally to a couple of points which she has made. The honourable lady from North Shropshire talks about the need for greater frequency in any business rates or any business taxation. And as she indicates, she believes that Liberal Democrats does not believe that this goes far enough and that annual revaluations are possible. And the lady from North Shropshire highlights specifically the Netherlands. It is important to note, whilst comparisons are difficult with fundamentally different countries of different populations, different approaches and the like, the Netherlands moved to annual revaluations in stages. And we are moving from 5 to 3 years in gradations. Again, as we've said previously, we will look to see where we can improve that in the future where it's possible. And then finally, although I probably accept that the honourable lady from North Shropshire will push her amendment to the vote, I will just gently try to dissuade her from doing so for a moment before she stands. The honourable lady is rightly outlining her concerns about the hugely important part of our economy, which is small businesses. I think all parties across this House share concerns about ensuring the viability and the vitality of the small business sector can be maintained and grown and improved. But I would just remind Liberal Democrats, I would just remind the honourable lady, 720,000 businesses already as a result of the decisions made on this bench by the Conservative government over the past 13 years and before, 720,000 businesses already have 100% small business rate relief. It's nearly 100,000 additional businesses, 76,000 are within the taper, so they offer partial relief. There is a 75% discount, which is coming in as a result of the revaluation this year for hospitality, retail and leisure sectors. And what I think small businesses want is certainty, which they won't get from the Liberal Democrats' policy of fundamental changes to the business rates landscape. And they want to understand that the governments of the day, the governments which put forward these kind of changes, have an understanding of the macroeconomic picture and the importance of being able to fulfil their promises. And the honourable lady, when I've looked at some of the proposals that have come from Liberal Democrats or Liberal Democrats supporting reports in recent years, they contain reductions in income from business taxation which would need to be covered by somebody, which means that taxes would need to go up elsewhere. And also, fundamentally, the leader of the Liberal Democrats continues to go out on media and come to this place asking for tens and hundreds of billions of pounds of additional spending. So the removal of income from business rates, Liberal Democrats have to ask themselves, where will they get the money from, and how will they pay for the black holes which they create within taxation as a whole? And it's for those. The Liberal Democrat, the Honourable Lady from North Shropshire is going to tell me exactly where she will find several £100 billion from in order to fill her back hole.
The question I'm going to ask Dame Rosie is that this amendment is about cutting red tape on small businesses, and I wonder if the Minister would agree with me that talking about other policy objectives which aren't relevant to this bill is really what he wants to be focusing on right at the moment.
And that tells us everything we need to say about Liberal Democrats. We only need to talk about this policy here. We can ignore every single other policy over here, because we'll look one way when we're talking to one part of the country and we'll look the other way when talking to the other part of the policy. It shows the Liberal Democrats' lack of seriousness in actually understanding how taxation works, in actually understanding how you need to run a modern dynamic market economy, and in understanding how you need to pay your way in order to make sure that your economy is successful over the long term. It is for those reasons that we will be opposing the amendments today.
Peter Alders.
Thank you, Dame Rosie. I will, with your leave, withdraw Amendment 4 and won't be putting it to the vote. But I would just very quickly say the points I put forward were very, very genuine. I do think this bill needs changing. I hope the government will look at that in an open mind in the other place. And it may well be that we will review this situation again. Thank you.
Is it your pleasure that the amendment be withdrawn?
Aye.
Amendment by leave withdrawn. With the leave of the House, I will now put the question that clauses 1 to 12 stand part of the bill. The question is that clauses 1 to 12 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Amendment 20 to clause 13 has been selected for separate decision. Helen Morgan to move.
Move formally.
The question is that Amendment 20 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No! Division. Clear the lobby.